So then I learned about Piaget, and Piaget had some very interesting ideas, and I think I've told you already what Piaget was up to. He wasn't a developmental psychologist. He didn't even regard himself as a psychologist. He wanted to reconcile science and religion. That's what he was doing through his entire bloody life, because it drove him crazy when he was an adolescent. And he didn't think that he would be able to survive unless he could bring those two things together. So he's working on the same problem. And so one of the things that Piaget, who was very prone to observation, he was an ethologist of human beings. That's a good way of thinking about it. An ethologist is a scientist who studies animals by watching their behavior rather than studying them under laboratory conditions. And he got very interested in the spontaneous emergence of morality in the play of children. And it was so smart, that idea that, you know, when kids come together and unify themselves towards a particular goal, so in play, that a morality emerges out of that. And that morality, and I've mentioned this before, there's a morality in game 1, there's a morality in game 2, there's a morality in game 3. What's common across all those moralities is a meta-morality. And so the meta-morality emerges from the particular moralities that are embedded in particular cooperative situations. We could say cooperative and competitive situations. You can expand that out biologically to some degree to the idea of the dominance hierarchy, right? Every social animal, and even many animals who aren't social, are embedded in a dominance hierarchy. The dominance hierarchy has a structure. We couldn't call it a dominance hierarchy. Dominance hierarchy A, B, C, D, E, thousands of them across thousands of years. You extract out from all of them what's central to all of them. That's the pyramid of value. What question do you need answered about the pyramid of value? What's at the top? Because that's the ideal. That's the I at the top of the pyramid, or the golden Buddha in the lotus. It's the same thing. It's the same thing as the crucifix, paradoxically enough. And that has to do with something like the voluntary acceptance and therefore transcendence of suffering. It's something like that. These are not arbitrary ideas. They're deeply, that's my case anyways, they're deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in biology and culture. They're as deeply rooted in biology as the dominance hierarchy is rooted in biology. And we already know the answer to that. The dominance hierarchy has been around for 350 million years. It's a long time. You don't get to just brush that off and say, well, morality is some sort of second order cognitive problem. It's like, no, it's not. I mean, I can tell you something about its instantiation in your nervous system. You have a counter at the bottom of your brain that keeps track of where you are in terms of your status. And it bloody well regulates the sensitivity of your emotions. So if you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, barely clinging on to the world, everything overwhelms you. And that's because you're damn near dead. And so everything should overwhelm you. You've got no extra resources. Any more threat, you're sunk. So you become extremely sensitive to negative emotion, and maybe also impulsive, so that you grab while the grabbing's good. And if you're nearer the top in the dominance hierarchy and your counter tells you that, then your serotonin levels go up, you're less sensitive to negative emotion, you're less impulsive, you live longer, like everything works in your favor. Your immune system functions better, and you're oriented at least to some degree towards the medium and long-term future. And you can afford that because all hell isn't breaking loose around you all the time. And so then the question is there a way of being that increases the probability that you're going to move up dominance hierarchies? Well, that doesn't seem to be a particularly provocative proposition, unless you think that it's completely arbitrary and random, and that you can think that if you want, but I don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. I mean, we certainly have, even for sexual selection, we impose criteria. They're not random and arbitrary. So, okay, so back to Jung. So what was Jung trying to do? Well, he was trying to see, Jung believed that once we had stopped populating the cosmos with gods, that they went inside. That's a good way of thinking. Well, think about it this way. You know, an archaic person looks at the sky and uses his imagination to populate the sky. What's the sky? Well, it's the constellations. It's the domain of the gods. Well, why? Well, because the gods are what are out there beyond your understanding. Well, that's what you see when you look up at the sky. So you populate the night sky with figures of your imagination. So the gods are the things that you broadcast out of your imagination and see spread over the world. It's like the contents of your unconscious are manifesting themselves when you encounter the unknown. It's exactly what it is. That's exactly how else could it be, right? You're projecting your fantasy onto what you don't understand. That's how you start to cope with what you don't understand. You populate the unknown with deities. Where did they come from? They came from your imagination. Well, what happens when you take them out of the world? Do they disappear? No. They just go back into your imagination. So that's where Jung dug down to find them. That's the same motif as rescuing your dead father or rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. It's the same idea, is that the corpses of the gods inhabit your imagination. So where do you go if you need to revivify them? You go into your imagination. And that's exactly what Jung did. And I mean, this is no secret. If you read Jung, he tells you that's what he did. He tells you that's why he did it. It's not an interpretation on my part. Well, so then the question is, what's down there? Is it just mess and catastrophe? Or is there something in it that's patterned? Well, Jung's proposition was that you rediscover the great archetypes that guide human being by investigating the structure of your imagination. When he thought about the imagination, in some sense, at least in part, as a manifestation of your biology. Well, yes. What else would it be? You know, and I told you that story about my nephew, I believe, right? About him running around as a knight and then going off to have a combat with the dwarves and the dragons. It's like, well, where did that come from? Well, partly it came from his culture, right? Because he was a knight, and so obviously that's a cultural construct. But the thing is that his imagination it's this structure that's looking for things to fill itself with, just like your predisposition to language. You have a predisposition to language. What is that? We don't know. What does it do? It looks for things in the world to fill itself with, right? And if you first of all, when you start to learn how to speak, you babble every phoneme. Did you know that? If I was learning to speak an Asian language, there would be phonemes I couldn't pronounce, and vice versa. An infant, all of them, they babble all the phonemes, and then as they start to learn the language, they lose the ability to say a bunch of them and only retain the ones that are relevant to that language. So a baby babbles all possible languages, that's a way of thinking about it, and then loses the ability. So that's you can see there. So you could say, well, you manifest the potential to be possessed by the set of all possible archetypes. It's built into your biology. And then as you're enculturated in your own culture, the set of archetypes that manifest themselves in that culture are the ones that you pull in for your own use. So my nephew's running around like a knight. Well, you know, if he would have been born in the middle of the Amazon, he would have been running around with a bow and, you know, a poisoned arrow and a bow. It's the same thing. It's the same idea. It's just trapped out in different cultural dress. And his little imagination was trying to solve the problem. How do you deal with the unknown? Well, what's the unknown? It's these little devils that keep jumping up on you and biting you, and they come out without end. So just killing them, it's like cutting the head off the Hydra, right? 7 more grow. Well, what the hell good is it to solve one problem when there's just a bunch more problems that are going to come after you? And that's everyone's question. That's the ultimate question of nihilism, right? Why bother solving a problem if all that's going to happen is that 20 more problems are going to come your way? Why not just give up and die? Well, right, it's a good question. It's a good question, right? Is the suffering so intense that the whole game should just be brought to an end? That's another fundamental question of existence. And people who've become truly malevolent answer that question in the affirmative. They say, it's too much, we should destroy it. Now, I wouldn't say they're precisely doing it only for humanitarian reasons, but you have to understand and appreciate the logic. It's not irrational. That's the other thing. It's not irrational to work for the destruction of being. It's not irrational. In fact, it might be the most rational thing you could come up with, Depends on your initial set of presuppositions. So Jung, down into the belly of the beast, so to speak, to see what lurks in the imagination. He sees the birthplace of archetypal ideas. Well, what are archetypal ideas? They're patterns of, you could think about them as representations of patterns of adaptive behavior. And so then you might ask, well, where did they come from? Well, that's part of what I've been trying to teach you about. They evolved, as far as I can tell, right? They evolved collectively, is that our society, and this is the dominance hierarchy idea. Dominance hierarchies set themselves up as a matter of course. They're the standard way that animals organize themselves in a territory. Well, okay, human beings are watching those dominance hierarchies since we became self-aware, thinking, what the hell are we up to? What the hell are we up to? And there's a question that lurks in there. What constitutes acceptable power? What constitutes acceptable sovereignty? Who should lead? Who should rule? What should be at the top? Well, we talked about that. The Mesopotamians figured that out. Speech and vision, that's Marduk. Speech, vision, and the willingness to confront the terrible unknown. That's what should rule. Well, what? Is that an arbitrary idea, or is that a great idea? How could it be any other way? Well, that's what human beings are like. And I don't think that you can read the Mesopotamian story and understand the reference, which isn't an easy thing to do, and fail to draw that conclusion. Marduk has eyes all the way around his head. He speaks magic words. He goes off to fight Tiamat, the dragon of chaos. Well, what's that? That's the reptilian predator that lurks in the unknown. Well, is any of that, is there anything about any of that that stands in opposition to what you would presume if you were just analyzing our situation from a purely biological perspective? We're prey animals, we're predators. We've been threatened by reptiles forever. Why wouldn't we use the predator that lurks in the dark forest or the water as a representative of the unknown? Why wouldn't we harness that circuitry? We already have it at hand, and even more to the point, how could we do anything else? It makes perfect sense. Well, so then you might say, well, what would you want to be king? You could say king of the world or king of your own soul. What do you want to subordinate yourself to? How about your heroic willingness to encounter the unknown and articulate it and share that with people? There's no nobler vision than that. And I don't see that it's merely arbitrary. And it's not merely arbitrary too, because if you do that, to the degree that you do that, assuming your society isn't entirely corrupt, you will be successful. It will actually aid you practically. You'll rise up above men. You'll be selected by women. You'll be admirable. You'll be valued. And you know that because if you look at the people that you admire and value, again, unless you've taken a detour into dark places and are possessed with admiration for people who are working for malevolent purposes and for destruction, you just have to watch the people that you admire and try to figure out what's common across them and draw your own conclusions. And you can ask yourself too, when you're torturing yourself with your conscience because you're not doing what you should be and you know it, what is it that you're torturing yourself in relationship to? You have a vision of your own ideal and you torment yourself if you're not matching it. What's the ideal? Well, you don't know, right? It's kind of incoherent and poorly articulated, but that doesn't mean it isn't trying to manifest itself and make itself known to you. It's really the purpose of religious education, is to make that ideal articulated.
So as men move into their careers, how might responsibility and purpose be conceptualized? Well, look, so I always start from the fundamental observation that life is characterized by a fair bit of suffering. There's a tragic element to life. Tragedy tainted by malevolence. And what that poses a problem, and the problem is, well, what can sustain you through suffering and tragedy? Betrayal and illness, death, loss, disappointment, frustration, confusion. And it's not hedonism. It's not happiness, not if you conceptualize happiness in this narrowly pleasure-seeking hedonic way. first of all, that doesn't iterate very well. You know, you can drink 26 of vodka one night, and that might be a pretty fun night, but you know the next 2 or 3 days are not going to be so pleasant, and you'll probably do at least 5 things that you seriously regret, assuming you can remember what they are. So it's not a great strategy, and everyone knows that, you know, that casual, impulsive pleasure seeking is not, it's not a good game. Everyone knows that. And that doesn't mean you should be afraid to try it, right? That's entirely different. You need to bash yourself around a bit. What did William Blake say? Wisdom through excess. There's definitely something to that. So, you know, walling yourself away from experimentation, that's not a good idea. But falling prey to indulgences, that's a catastrophe. So you can't find, and then if your life is proceeding in a direction that's painful and tragic for reasons that might be really out of your control, obviously you're not going to be happy during those times. You may not have even the opportunity to seek anything that's pleasurable or the ability to experience it. So then what's going to sustain you under those circumstances and sustain your will to live, but even more importantly, protect you from the resentment and the moral corruption that unrequited suffering can so easily produce? And the answer to that is not happiness, but something like meaning. And then you might ask yourself, well, where is meaning to be found? And the answer seems to be primarily through the voluntary adoption of responsibility. You know, so people find meaning in the love they have for their partner and their decision to care for someone else as well or better than they would care for themselves. They find meaning in that, and it can sustain itself across many, many decades, for better or for worse. That's no joke, that phrase. They find meaning in the relationship they establish with their children, assuming they take the responsibility for that relationship. They find meaning in their friendships. They find meaning in their business associations, their civic engagement. You know, people moralize at, older people moralize at younger people and say, well, you should accept your responsibility. You should shoulder your duty. And that's true, but it isn't exactly that you should do it because you should do it, even though you should. It's that there isn't anything better that you can possibly do. Like, you have to justify yourself to yourself. You have to justify yourself to yourself because of your inadequacies and your failure and your error and your propensity to repeat errors that you know you shouldn't repeat, your sinful nature. You have to atone for that. And then you have to justify your life to yourself because it's characterized by death and suffering. And so you need something worthwhile to do. And, well, then you might say, well, there's nothing worthwhile to do. It's, well, you're probably not really in any position to make that judgment, you know, until you've gone all in at least one thing. At least one thing. Because, like, who the hell are you? You're 16, you're cynical and nihilistic. It's like, you're not wise. You're not a philosopher. You don't know anything. And thank God, right? Because you don't even want to think you know anything because you're bloody miserable and you're suffering. And so if you're also right, well, then you're doomed. So you better bloody well pray that your cynicism and nihilism, unearned though it may be, is based on a fundamental falsehood. And it is. You can find deep significance in your life, and you find it essentially through the decision to voluntarily bear your suffering and to trudge uphill nonetheless. And there's something heroic about that in the most fundamental sense. And that heroism is something so deeply meaningful that it, in some sense, triumphs over even death. And so as you move forward through life, you mature, you start by developing responsibility for yourself, your friends, your roommates, then you take on a partner, and you have a family, and you expand the domain of responsibility and generosity, and you want to expand that. Who knows how much you can expand that? You know, you could be a credit to the nation. Well, there's an aim. Why don't you aim to be like credit to the nation by the time you're 50? Because what, you got something better to do than that? And the answer to that's no. And, you know, what are you going to do? You're going to pursue endless one-night stands. You're going to bury yourself nose deep in cocaine. You're going to become an alcoholic. You're going to pursue that tinsely, trashy hedonism that is nothing but destructive and generates nothing but self-contempt, and then bitterness, then misery, then vengefulness. It's like, that's why do that? I mean, it's easier in some sense, right? Although it's not, because it's rife with catastrophe and suffering. So it's way better to take on, to envision yourself as, that's the cross image fundamentally, right? The pathway to redemption is to bear your cross up the hill voluntarily. It's a hell of a thing to ask, right? Because you have to accept the fundamental limits of your mortal vulnerability. And you have to say to yourself, I will do good nonetheless. Right? And that's not obedience. That's not naivete. That's a cold decision, man. So everyone great makes that decision. So make that decision, because maybe you're great.
I don't have any aims, and then I say, well, pick the least objectionable of the aims and act it out for a while and see what happens, because sometimes your emotional systems are so fouled up that you have to pretend, you have to act the thing out before you can start to believe it. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. I thought, God, that's such a good idea. Because it's not optimistic exactly. You know, some people will tell you, well, you can be happy. It's like, those people are idiots. I'm telling you, they're idiots. There's going to be things that come along that flatten you so hard you won't believe it. And you're not happy then. And so if life is to be happy, well, in those situations, what are you doing? Why even live? But life isn't to be happy. If you're happy, you're bloody fortunate, and you should enjoy it. You should, because it's the grace of God, so to speak. People know when they're doing something meaningful. They can tell, so why the hell don't they do meaningful things all the time? It seems obvious. You could do it. I mean, it's hard, you know, because other people want you to do other things, and it's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. Oh, I get it. I see why. It took me about 10 years to figure this out. People have a choice. Choice number one, nothing you do means anything. Well, that's kind of a drag, right? It's meaninglessness of life and all that, existential angst. You know, that's kind of a pain. But the upside of nothing that you do is meaningful is you don't have to do anything. You've got no responsibility. Now, you have to suffer because things are meaningless, but that's a small price to pay. The alternative is everything you do matters. Really. If you make a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you betray someone, you tilt the world a little more sharply towards evil rather than good. It matters what you do. Well, if you buy that, then you can have a meaningful life. But there's no mucking around. It means responsibility. It means that the decisions you make are important. It means that when you do something wrong, it's wrong. Well, do you want that? This is the Peter Pan story, roughly speaking. Peter Pan is this magical boy. Pan is the god of everything, roughly speaking, right? And so it's not an accident that he has the name Pan. And he's the boy that won't grow up. And he's magical. Well, that's because children are magical. They can be anything. They're nothing but potential. And Peter Pan doesn't want to give that up. Why? Well, he's got some adults around him, but the main adult is Captain Hook. Well, who the hell wants to grow up to be Captain Hook? First of all, you've got a hook. Second, you're a tyrant. And third, you're chased by the dragon of chaos with a clock in its stomach, right? The crocodile. It's already got a piece of you. Well, that's what happens when you get older. Time has already got a piece of you. And eventually, it's got a taste for you. And eventually, it's going to eat you. And so Hook is so traumatized by that he can't help but be a tyrant. And then Peter Pan looks at traumatized Hook and says, well, no, I'm not sacrificing my childhood for that. So that's fine, except he ends up king of the Lost Boys. In Neverland, well, Neverland doesn't exist, and who the hell wants to be king of the Lost Boys? And he also sacrifices the possibility that he'll have a real relationship with a woman, because that's Wendy, right? And she's kind of conservative, middle-class, London-dwelling girl. She wants to grow up and have kids and have a life. She accepts her mortality. She accepts her maturity. Peter Pan has to content himself with Tinkerbell. She doesn't even exist. She's like the fairy of porn. She doesn't exist. She's the substitute for the real thing. But the dichotomy that you're talking about is very tricky, because there's a sacrificial element in maturation, right? You have to sacrifice the pluripotentiality of childhood for the actuality of a frame. And the question is, well, why would you do that? Well, one reason is it happens to you whether you do it or not. You can either choose your damn limitation, or you can let it take you unaware when you're 30, or even worse, when you're 40. And then that is not a happy day. I see people like this, and I think it's more and more common in our culture, because people can put off maturity without suffering an immediate penalty. But all that happens is the penalty accrues, and then when it finally hits, it just wallops you. Because when you're 25, you could be an idiot. It's no problem. Even when you're out in a job search, it's like, well, you don't have any experience and you're kind of clueless. It's yeah, you're young, it's no problem. That's what young people are like, but they're full of potential. Okay, well, now you're the same person at 30. It's like people aren't so thrilled about you at that point. It's like, what the hell have you been doing for the last 10 years? Well, I'm just as clueless as I was when I was 22. It's, yeah, but you're not 22. You're an old infant, right? And that's an ugly thing, an old infant. So, part of the reason you choose your damn sacrifice, because the sacrifice is inevitable, but at least you get to choose it. And then there's something that's even more complex than that in some sense, is that the problem with being a child is that all you are is potential, and it's really low resolution. You could be anything, but you're not anything. So then you go and you adopt an apprenticeship, roughly speaking, and then at least you become something. And when you're something, that makes the world open up to you again. Like if you're a really good plumber, then you end up being far more than a plumber, right? You end up being a good employer. If you're a really good plumber, well, then you have some employees, you run a business, you train some other people, you enlarge their lives, you're kind of a pillar of the community, you have your family. Once you pass through that narrow training period, which narrows you and constricts you and develops you at the same time, then you can come out the other end with a bunch of new possibility at hand. And Jung talked about that. He thought that part of the proper path of development in the last half of life was to rediscover the child that you left behind as you were apprenticing. And so then you get to be something and regain that potential at the same time. Very, very smart. Well, he was very, very smart. So that's a very wise thing to know. So, yeah. Sacrifice. You get to pick your damn sacrifice. That's all. You don't get to not make one. You're sacrificial whether you want to be or not. That's a good thing to know as well. It's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world.
Competent and dangerous?
Mm-hmm.
Why dangerous?
Because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak. They're weak.
How is it good to be dangerous?
Because it makes you formidable. And life is a very difficult process. And you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like, those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order. And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. It's like, that's a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea. Because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life. You can't bear any responsibility. You'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous.
But one thing I'm not getting, there's a big difference between letting people do something for themselves and saying men should be dangerous. By dangerous, that implies I should be ready to threaten someone, to hurt somebody.
No, you should be capable of it. But that doesn't mean you should use it. There's nothing to you otherwise. Like if you're not a formidable force, there's no morality in your self-control. If you're incapable of violence, not being violent isn't a virtue. People who teach martial arts know this full well, right?
If you learn a martial art, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously you learn to control it. Both of those come together. And the combination of that capacity for danger and the capacity for control is what brings about the virtue. Otherwise you confuse weakness with moral virtue. I'm harmless, therefore I'm good. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. That isn't how it works at all. If you're harmless, you're just weak. And if you're weak, you're not going to be good. You can't be, because it takes strength to be good. It's very difficult to be good. People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure, because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. But you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile.
You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful, so I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. You would like to be productive and have a good life, and that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great, and you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. So that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is to plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss, and both of those work for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. But, my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with. And you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people, because they don't like themselves very much. They're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating, and cracking the whip and then procrastinating, and it's like, God, it's so boring and such a pathetic way of spending your time. And you know what that's like, because you probably waste like 6 hours a day. What you do now is going to multiply its effects in the future. And you need to know what your damn time is worth. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, what if I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is, if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibility-less bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. Someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face. If you could have what you wanted in this moment, and I could deliver it, what would it be? How much of the mess that you see around you would vanish if the mess that you could put straight was put straight? You know perfectly well that if you put your mind to it and you make the proper sacrifices, there are things you can set straight.
What advice do you have for a young man in his 20s?
Make a plan. Look at what you're interested in. Get disciplined about something. Allow for the possibility that you have something important to contribute to the world, and that the world would be a lesser place without that contribution. Don't be afraid of taking on responsibility. It's where you find what sustains you in your life. You can take on too much responsibility. You have to be cautious in that regard, but that's a less common problem than not taking on enough. A lot of the things that people regard as traps are actually the means to their life. You have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with, and you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people because they don't like themselves very much. You have to believe that your action has some redemptive possibility, because why would you do it otherwise? And you might say, well, I kind of believe that. It's like, well, that's not good enough. You know, you kind of got to throw yourself all into it. And what's the cost anyways? It's not like you're going to get out of this alive. So you're pretty much all in, whether you want to be or not. And maybe if you were voluntarily all in, things would be a lot better than they are. If the world isn't everything that you want it to be, maybe you're not acting the way you should. One of the things people do to buttress themselves against failure is to never let themselves really gain clarity about what they need and want. Let's say you try something, but you only do it half-heartedly. And then you fail, and you think, well, I didn't really fail because, you know, I held a bunch back in reserve, and so I didn't get what I wanted, but maybe had I been all in, I would have. And so you don't have to upbraid yourself too much for the failure. Now, it's a catastrophic way to live, to sit on the fence and to not commit, because instead of risking the possibility of failure, you engage in what's essentially the absolute certainty of failure. Because if you want something worthwhile and difficult, which you probably do if you want to have an adventure and go somewhere, then what's the chance you're going to get it if you're halfway in? You can't be halfway in, but that sort of protects you against failure, because you can tell yourself, well, if I tried, I could have done it. It's like, you know, you tell yourself that 200 times and your life's over. Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal, you specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Would it really be so terrible if my life wasn't miserable? Would it be so terrible if I got what I wanted and needed, especially if I was doing that in the best possible way? Well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from, I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. So, yeah, there's lots of reasons to, you know, because I've thought for a long time, imagine you have a choice in front of you, because you do. So here's the choice. Your life is either meaningful or meaningless. Okay, so let's go through the meaningless part first. Because you think, well, of course I don't want it to be meaningless. It's like, yeah, just hold on a second. Nothing you do matters. And so impulsive pleasure is the order of the day. No responsibility. You can do whatever you want. It's like Pleasure Island in Pinocchio, right? Or it's like Neverland in Peter Pan. You're still a kid. You can play all the time.
Yeah.
Impulsive pleasure and no responsibility. That's the reward for meaninglessness. Well, but then the other side is, okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters, right? Make a mistake, hurts you, hurts your family, hurts the world in a deeper way than you think. And you have to be awake to that. And then you have to take it on yourself. Well, so you're moving from point A to point B in your little circumscribed world. You've made everything invisible. And as long as that works, then your theory's good enough. It's accurate enough. It's true enough. You're in your little paradise. But if something comes up and objects, well, that's where your character is tested fundamentally. That's the character test. It's like, what do you do with messages of error? And that's a tricky issue. Okay, so here's a solution to that. Here's what not to do. I am a bad person. I got to see myself. I'm a bad person. I might as well just go jump off the bridge. It's like, no, that's not good, because what that means is that every time you try to learn something, you're going to make a mistake, because what do you know? So you're going to make mistakes. And if the rule is every time you make a mistake, you're going to go jump off the bridge, then that's not a useful problem-solving strategy. And so when you make a mistake, you don't get to beat yourself to death with a club. It's a bad strategy, and you'll have your internal tyrant in there who's perfectly happy about doing that. That's the, overactive superego that Freud talked about. Maybe it came to you via a parent who was too authoritarian, or a grandparent, or maybe it's just you because you're disagreeable and neurotic, and so you'll take or hyper-conscientious. You'll take yourself apart. Well, you've got a problem. Something has objected to you. Then the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, maybe you're not looking at the world right. Maybe your goals are wrong. Maybe you're not acting properly. It's okay. So the question that arises when an obstacle emerges is, which part of this structure needs attention? And the first answer can't be all of it, which is why when you're arguing with someone in an intimate relationship and you're angry at them and you want to win, which is a big mistake, you want to win, you say, well, this is what you're like. Here's another 10 examples of how you've done that in the past, and I can enumerate more of them if you'd like. And so that's actually what you're like, and I've tried fixing you and it didn't work, and so it looks like you're going to be like that up into the future. And you're basically saying to them, well, you're a bad person, and the only thing they can do is either collapse or punch you. And punching you is actually better than collapsing. You know what I mean? It's such a counterproductive way of arguing. You don't leave the person any out. And so maybe, well, they're civilized, so it doesn't get physical. Well, maybe that's good and maybe it isn't. But then they end up either really not happy with you in a way that they will manifest the first possible opportunity they get, or they have to go off in the corner and cringe. It's like, great, you won. It's like now your partner's either hates you or is cringing. It's great. That's a real good victory, man. Rack up about 100 victories like that and you'll be in divorce court and spending $250,000 while being miserable about it. Yeah. So anyway, something objects to you and you think, okay, well, I need to take myself apart, right? Because there's a piece that's broken somewhere. And then you might think, well, let's assume it's a little piece to begin with. That's the right mechanism. It's like, okay, you got a C-. That doesn't prove that you're stupid. Now, it implies that you might be stupid, but it doesn't, right, really, it does, and that's why you don't want to look at it. Maybe it implies that you're lazy, or implies that you're ignorant, or like it implies all sorts of terrible. Might imply that you're a bad person even. But you don't want to leap to that, and that's sort of the proclamation of innocence before guilt. Assume that you're the least amount of reprehensible and ignorant possible. And so then you look at the micro routines. It's okay, well, I got a C- in this course. Maybe I should study for that course 15 minutes more a day for the next 3 months. And then you ask yourself, do you think you could do that? No, I'm too useless. Okay, how about 15 minutes every second day? You think you could do that? You put it in your schedule, like 15 minutes every second day in the morning. And that's, well, you think, well, what's wrong with me? Well, I'm not very good at managing my study schedule. That's not quite down here at the behavioral level, but it's pretty close, because what you can take an action. You can open up your schedule and you can say, oh, I'll mark 15 minutes aside. Then you can practice doing that. It's pretty low level in the hierarchy. It means, well, you're still not a horrible person. You just got to polish up your work ethic. And so what you want to do is it's like It's like the old adage, you got to stand up for yourself, but you don't want to make unnecessary enemies. That's a really good thing to know. It's like, shut the hell up most of the time, but now and then you don't shut up because it's time to say something. You don't want to make unnecessary enemies though. Well, you don't want to take yourself apart any more than is absolutely necessary. Start little, and you do that with people around you too. Like if you have a child, you know, and the child does something that isn't right, then you think, okay, minimal necessary intervention. What can we do to decrease the probability that that's going to occur in the future? So, and that's a good thing to know with children. It's also a good thing to know with your partners. You're having an argument with them. It's like, okay, what the hell do you want? What's the minimum thing you can request from them that would satisfy you? And the evil part of your soul is going to be, I want them cringing in a corner. It's like, yeah, get that stuff under control, man. See if you can figure out what that person could offer you that would be minimal that you would accept. And then tell them that. It's like, here's the words I would like you to say in the apology I would like you to formulate, assuming that you think you did something wrong. We have to argue about that because maybe you didn't. But if you did, I want to specify it precisely and narrowly, and I want to give you an escape route. And you know, you might only be able to do it badly because you're still mad. So you apologize half-heartedly. It's like you get a pat on the head for that. Good. Next time it'll be 51% not half-heartedly, right? So it's careful training. It's careful training of yourself and other people with the goal in mind, but also with the least amount of harshness possible. And then the other thing to do as well, and this is also true for you, and this is something I learned from studying the behaviorists, is like watch the people around you like a hawk. Whenever they do something that you think is good, you tell them. That's wisdom, man. You'll get so far with that you cannot bloody well believe it, because most people, you know, they're afraid of any number of things, but one of the things they're really afraid of is that now and then they'll creep out of their cynical shell and try to do something good. You know, it's like they're popping out this thing that's unbelievably vulnerable. They'll try to do something good and creep right back into their persona, and they'll look around, see if anyone noticed. And sometimes they'll get punished for it, and then, well, then they won't do it again, so don't do that. But then, now and then you think, hey, I saw you do this. That was actually pretty good. And they think, oh, wow, someone noticed, you know, it's like, wow. And then they'll think, yeah, I could do that again. And if you want to live with someone for a long period of time, I would say every time they do something that you would like them to do more of, number one, notice. Number two, tell them, right? Because I know you don't want to, because you really want to dominate them, and you don't want them thriving, because then they'd be competition to you, and you wouldn't be able to go complain to your mother about what a miserable partner you have, and you know how delightful that is. So you have to forego all that pleasure if you actually helped your person develop. So you got to get over all that. It's really annoying. So, you know, you've got this person pegged as, yeah, you're stuck with them, and you know, maybe it's the best you can do, but you got one eye open. And then every time they do something good, you don't want to notice, because if that elevated them a little bit, you wouldn't be able to feel so resentful and miserable and keep your eye open for the next possible affair. And that is what people are like. That is what people are like, and that's what you're like too. That's what people are like. So you got to decide if that's what you want, or you want to help the person that you're with grow, you know. Now it's dangerous because they might outshine you. Well, good. Then you have someone to compare yourself to. That'd be a good deal. It's really rough with kids, you know, because parents will stop their children from succeeding beyond them. They get jealous, and then they'll put them down, and then they have kids that do not like them, and they'll pay for it. You know, if you take people, and I told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created, to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world, so what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. And then the second part of that is, well, imagine that many people did that, because we've done a lot as human beings. We've done a lot of remarkable things, and I've told you already, I think before, that today, for example, about 250,000 people will be lifted out of abject poverty, and about 300,000 people attached to the electrical power grid. We're lifting people out of poverty collectively at a faster rate that's ever occurred in the history of humankind by a huge margin. And that's been going on unbelievably quickly since the year 2000. The UN had planned to have poverty between 2000 and 2015, and it was accomplished by 2013. So there's inequality developing in many places, and you hear lots of political agitation about that. But overall, the tide is lifting everyone up, and that's a great thing. We have no idea how fast we can multiply that if people got their act together and really aimed at it. Because, you know, my experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be, who knows how much more efficient? 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time. Not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal, or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt. And that's the thing that's interesting too, is that, and like another thing I've often asked my undergraduate classes is, you know, there's this idea that people have a conscience. And you know what the conscience is. It's this feeling or voice you have in your head just before you do something that you know is stupid, telling you that probably you shouldn't do that stupid thing. You don't have to listen to it, strangely enough. But you go ahead and do it anyways, and then, of course, exactly what the conscience told you was going to happen inevitably happens, so that you feel even stupider about it than you would if it happened by accident. Because you know, I knew this was going to happen, I got a warning it was going to happen, and I went and did it anyways. And the funny thing too is that conscience operates within people, and we really don't understand what the hell that is. So you might say, well, what would happen if you abided by your conscience for 5 years or for 10 years? What sort of position might you be in? What sort of family might you have? What sort of relationship might you be able to forge? And you can be bloody sure that a relationship that's forged on the basis of who you actually are is going to be a lot stronger and more welcome than one that's forged on the basis of who you aren't. Now, of course, that means that the person you're with has to deal with the full force of you in all your ability and your catastrophe, and that's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate. But if you do negotiate it, well, at least you have something, you have somewhere solid to stand, and you have somewhere to live. You have a real life, and it's a great basis upon which to bring children into the world, for example, because you can have an actual relationship with them instead of torturing them half to death, which is what happens in a tremendously large minority of cases. Well, it's more than that too, because, and this is what I'll close with, and this is why I wanted to introduce Solzhenitsyn's writings to you. You see, because it isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate, it's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you know, you think, well, there's 9 billion, 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly. But 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion. And so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least, over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1 million, and 2 persons away from 1 billion. And so that's how you're connected. And the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend. And it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really asked yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. But I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. You know, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life, and they still suffer. Yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr, so that's a pretty good deal, all things considered, especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, what Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends. Because that's what happened in the 20th century. Well, I'll tell you a couple of strange things, things that I don't really understand. The first is, when we've done the analysis of the effects of the future authoring program, it has had a differential impact on men. And it's had a particularly differential impact on what I would call excluded men. And so that would be non-Western ethnic minority men, or what, majority men who aren't doing very well. So for example, at Mohawk College, the future authoring program had a particularly robust effect on Mohawk College students who were men who hadn't done very well in high school and who hadn't picked a major that had a destination, a career destination at its end. So you can imagine those people they have an ambiguous relationship with the idea of education, and they're not oriented specifically towards a goal. They're not very motivated. Now, why did it have a differential effect on men? That's a good question. Well, first of all, the women are doing better. So it might just be a matter of the fact that it does better for people who aren't doing as well, and at the moment most of them are men. I think that might be part of it. But I don't believe that's all of it. I think that part of the reason that women are doing better is because they're agreeable. And so if a system sets out a structure and says, here's a pathway to attainment, the women won't rebel against that, they'll go along with it. And that's working very well for them at the moment. the men, especially the men on the disagreeable end of the distribution, and there's way more men on the disagreeable end of the distribution than there are women, right? That's what you get from, if you look at overlapping normal distributions. So there's the female distribution for agreeableness, male distribution for agreeableness. Tremendous overlap. Okay, women are higher. All the really agreeable people are women. All the really disagreeable people are men. And maybe the real differences occur at the extremes, right? And it's a very interesting side effect of overlapping distributions. So people can be mostly the same, but that can still produce radical differences. Disagreeable men won't do anything they don't want to do. They just say, up yours. I'll go home and play video games. Are you with you? I'm not listening to your stupid classes. And why should I work for you? I'll just go have fun. I'll do my own thing. I don't think they're motivated. And so then if you take the men who are like that and you say, okay, what do you want? You can have what you want, but you have to figure out what it is. So then they write down what they want and they think, oh, hey, well, that might be worth having, so maybe I'll put some effort into it. That's what it looks like to me. Now, that's weak evidence. And this is a weak argument. But I'm trying to stretch out my understanding to account for this. But I'll tell you something else that's really weird. I don't understand this either. So more than 90% of the people who watch my videos on YouTube are men. Now that's weird because about 80% of psychology students are women. So that is not what you would expect, right? You'd expect that the majority of them would be women. And you might say, well, it's because of the political stance I've taken. And I thought, well, that's possible. So I went and looked at the demographic data because I have that. Well, before I did any of the political videos, 85% of my viewers were men. So it's actually increased a bit. It's increased by 6%. And that's not trivial, but it was still overwhelmingly men. So that was interesting. I thought, what the hell? Why is that exactly? And then now I've been watching crowds when I've been talking to them. And the crowds that have come to see me in person. This happened at the University of Toronto free speech debate. And I actually noticed it and commented on it before the debate took place because I was talking about intrinsic differences between men and women. And I looked around the room and I thought, hey, 80% of the people in this room are men. So I had all the women stand up and then all the men stand up. I said, look, like, here's a natural experiment. For some reason, 80% of the people who showed up to this are men. Now, everybody thought I was kind of cracked to do that. And it was a risk, but I thought, no, there's something going on here. And then what's interesting now is that every public appearance that I've made that's related to the sort of topics that we're discussing is overwhelmingly men. It's like 85 to 90%. And so I thought, wow, that's weird. Like, what the hell's going on here exactly? And then the other thing I've noticed is that I've been talking a lot to the crowds that I've been talking to, not about rights, but about responsibility, right? Because you can't have the bloody conversation. What are you doing? You can't have the conversation about rights without the conversation about responsibility because your rights are my responsibility. That's what they are, technically. So you just can't have only half of that discussion. And we're only having half that discussion. And the question is, well, what the hell are you leaving out if you only have that half of the discussion? And the answer is, well, you're leaving out responsibility. And then the question is, well, what are you leaving out if you're leaving out responsibility? And the answer might be, well, maybe you're leaving out the meaning of life. That's what it looks like to me. It's like, here you are, suffering away. What makes it worthwhile? Rights? You're completely out. You have no idea what it's almost impossible to describe how bad an idea that is. Responsibility. That's what gives life meaning. It's like lift a load. Then you can tolerate yourself, right? Because look you're useless, easily hurt, easily killed. Why should you have any self-respect? That's the story of the fall. Pick something up and carry it. Make it heavy enough so that you can think, yeah, well, useless as I am, at least I could move that from there to there. Well, what's really cool about that is that when I talk to these crowds about this, the men's eyes light up. And that's I've seen that phenomenon because I've been talking about this mythological material for a long time. And I can see when I'm watching crowds, people, their eyebrows lift, their eyes light up because I put something together for them. And that's what mythological stories do. So I'm not taking responsibility for that. That's what the stories do. So I say the story and people go click, 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 and their eyes light up. But this responsibility thing, that's a whole new order of this, is that young men are so hungry for that, it is unbelievable. And one of the things I've been talking to some of the people who've been running for the Conservative leadership in Canada, and I've been talking to them about well, the difficulties they have communicating with young people, because conservatives, what the hell are they going to sell to young people, right? Because being conservative is something that happens when you're older. They can sell responsibility. No one's selling it. And the thing is, for men, there's nothing but responsibility. You know, I was watching The Simpsons the other day. I watched the first Simpsons episode, and I deconstructed it. And so it's really interesting. So what happens in the first Simpson episode is that it's Christmas, and Homer and Marge are going to buy some Christmas presents, but Homer doesn't get his Christmas bonus. And so he's absolutely crushed by that. And that actually is a recurring theme in The Simpsons, where Homer loses his job or something like that, or can't make enough money. He's completely crushed. Even though he's kind of useless, bumbling, laughing fool of a guy, you know, the thing that gives that show its soul is that he's still oriented towards his family. That's what makes him honorable, is that foolish as he is, he's decided to adopt responsibility for his family and to try to bear that. And so he's a holy fool. He's not a complete fool. And it's so interesting watching the story because he suffers dreadfully as a consequence of not being able to fulfill his responsibility. Well, that's for men. Women have their sets of responsibilities. They're not the same, right? Because they're complicated, because women, of course, have to take primary responsibility for having infants at least, but then also for caring for them. They're structured differently than men. For biological necessity, even if it's not a psychological issue, and it's also partly a psychological issue. Women know what they have to do. Men have to figure out what they have to do. And if they have nothing worth living for, then they stay Peter Pan. And why the hell not? Because the alternative to valued responsibility is impulsive, low-class pleasure. And you saw that in the Pinocchio story, right? That's Pleasure Island. It's like, well, why lift the load if there's nothing in it for you? That's another thing that we're doing to men that's a very bad idea. And to boys. It's like, you're pathological and oppressive. It's like, fine then, why the hell am I going to play? If that's the situation, if I get no credit for bearing responsibility, you can bloody well be sure I'm not going to bear any. But then, you know, your life is useless and meaningless, and you're full of self-contempt and nihilism, and that's not good. And so that's why I think, that's what I think's going on at a deeper level with regards to men needing this direction. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. He has to decide that. Yeah, well, you know, partly what you're trying to do in the future authoring process is say, okay, well, what's your highest value? Right? It's the star. It's like, okay, what are you aiming for? You can decide, man. But, you know, there's some criteria. It should be good for you. It should be good for you in a way that facilitates you moving forward. Maybe it should be good for you in a way that's also good for the family and the community. It should cover the domain of life. I mean, there's constraints on what you should regard as a value, but within those constraints you have the choice. You have choice. Well, the thing is that people will carry a heavy load if they get to pick the goddamn load. So, and they think, well, I won't carry any load. It's like, okay, fine, but then you're like the sled dog that doesn't have a sled to pull. You're gonna tear pieces out of your own legs because you're bored. You know, people are pack animals. They need to pull against a weight. And that's not true for everyone. It's not true particularly, say, for low conscientious people. I mean, maybe they're open and creative or extroverted and some other things. But for the typical person, they'll eat themselves up unless they have a load. This is why there's such an opiate epidemic among dispossessed white middle-aged guys who are unemployed in the US. It's like they lose their job, they're done, right? They despise themselves. They develop chronic pain syndromes and depression. And the chronic pain is treated with opiates. It's like, that's what we're doing. So, yeah, that's what it looks like to me. Is you have to, and it's so interesting to watch the young men when you talk to them about responsibility. They're so goddamn thrilled about it. It just blows me away. It's like, really? That's the counterculture. Grow the hell up and do something useful. Really? I could do that? Oh, I'm so excited by that idea. No one ever mentioned that before. It's like rights, 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 rights. Jesus, it's appalling. And I feel that that's deeply felt by the people who are coming out to listen to these sorts of things too. They've had enough of that. So, and they better have, because it's a non-productive mode of being. Responsibility, man. That's where the meaning in life is. So. So imagine you have a goal in mind. You want to get to work in the morning. I used to ask my students a question like this, is like, what? Maybe they're going to write an essay. Why are you writing the essay? Why are you in class? Well, I'm in class because I need this class because it's part of my major. Well, why did you pick a major like that? Well, I'm interested in psychology. Well, why did you come to get a degree? Well, I think I need a degree to get a job. Well, why do you need a job? Well, I need a job to keep body and soul together, and maybe to be productive, and maybe to, establish a name for myself. And why do you want to do that? Well, because, it's part and parcel of living properly. And why do you want to live properly? And well, then, and how would you live if you lived properly? And at that point, people are usually unable to answer. Because you can just push people with questions about why until they run out of explanations. But the point is that you're always doing whatever you're doing because what you're doing is nested in a sequence of goal-directed actions. And those can be more or less sophisticated. If you're not very sophisticated at all, the nesting might be like 2 structures deep. Maybe you're, you're bored and you want to go get drunk, and why? Well, because you don't want to be bored. And if someone pushes you a little farther than that, you hit them. And, you don't want to delve into it. But if you're sophisticated, you have a pretty good hierarchy of answers. So you might say, well, why do you want to be a productive and generous citizen? And like I said, people usually bottom out there. But you could say, well, that's part of reciprocal altruism, and if I'm productive and generous, then that'll encourage other people to be productive and generous, and if we're all productive and generous together, then there'll be more for everyone, and we'll all get along better, and we'll get along for a longer period of time, and that'll make us all more stable, and that'll make our societies better. And then you might say, well, why is that relevant? You might say, well, because the alternative to that is something like a descent into something approximating hell, and so that's part of a reflection of the divine order and the eternal battle between good and evil. And then you could push it farther than that, and you could say, well, are you going to be on the side of the redemptive hero, or are you going to be on the side of the eternal adversary? Like, you can keep digging down farther and farther, and the farther down you dig, the more you get down into what you might describe as the implicit religious substrate. And it's very much useful to know that and to make as much of that conscious as possible. So now imagine that you've come to this talk tonight because you've decided to aim up. And maybe you haven't formulated that precisely explicitly, but something is driving you in this direction. And then you come to the talk and you find out that I'm talking about something that isn't what you expected, and it doesn't seem to be moving you along on your pathway forward to that end. And what's going to happen is you're going to be disappointed. And you might be anxious too. You're going to be disappointed because disappointment signals that you're experiencing something that's not relevant to the goal that you are attempting to pursue, and that might in fact be interfering with it. That's what negative emotion does. And maybe if you're disappointed in what I say, that also makes you anxious because you assumed that you would come here and I would say something relevant, because you assumed that you knew who I was, and then it turned out that I didn't, and then you don't know who I am, and then you don't know what you're doing here, and then you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because that's what anxiety is for. It tells you when the pathway to your goal has been disrupted. So multiple pathways have now emerged. So imagine you're driving your car to work and it quits. And what happens is you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because, well, you were beetling along quite nicely in your world, and everything was reduced to like a unidimensional simplicity. You weren't in a car as an object, you were in a thing that took you to where you wanted to go, and it was just doing what it was supposed to be doing, tracking you along the pathway to your goal. And then it fails and you're off on the side of the road, and you get anxious because how the hell are you going to get to work? And what if you don't get to work? And is your boss not going to be very happy with you? And maybe this is the 3rd mistake you've made this week. And what if you get fired? And weren't you an idiot for buying this car? Maybe you shouldn't have a car at all. Maybe you should have walked to work. And maybe you should take a bicycle, because after all, that would save the planet. And and maybe now you have to take your car to a mechanic, but the last time you went to the the mechanic, you got ripped off because you're too stupid about vehicles to manage one, and you're kind of stupid about technology in general, and aren't you stupid? And maybe you're too stupid, and isn't your wife going to... That's anxiety, right? And that's the emergence of a multiplicity of pathways, right? And so what anxiety signifies is the degeneration of an attentional hierarchy into multiplicity. And the reason you get anxious and it feels bad is because now your body can't compute how much energy you have to put out in order to get to your goal. And so you can't organize the world. You're apt to use more resources than you'll replenish. And if you continue to do that, then you'll die. And so anxiety is a signal that complexity has reemerged, chaos. That's the eternal dragon of chaos. Chaos has reemerged because your narrative has collapsed. And so that's negative emotion. That's what negative emotion signifies, is that it's the collapse of an organizing narrative. And so that's very interesting to know. So you feel positive. If I walk on the stage and I know I'm supposed to go to the front of the stage, say, and the reason I want to do that is because I know I have to talk to you, and that's and I want to talk to you because I think it's valuable to talk to you, etc. That's nested in a hierarchy of value. And if I see a clear pathway to the front of the stage, then that actually produces positive emotion. And that positive emotion impels me forward, because positive emotion does impel you forward. That's what it's for. That's how positive emotion is linked to action. So if you're enthusiastic because you can see a pathway forward to a valued goal, and that enthusiasm manifests itself. This is true even neurochemically. It manifests itself as positive motivation to move forward. And not only that, if you're moving forward and it's working, your brain tracks the fact that it's working, and then that's linked to dopamine release, by the way, which is what cocaine releases. It's linked to dopamine release. And the other thing your brain is doing, even when you're just walking to where you want to go, if you're successfully walking there, your brain tracks what you're doing. There's circuits that are activated while you're doing it. And if what you're doing results in the result you desired, then the dopamine floods those little neurons that are active, and it makes them grow and flourish. And so as you practice something that's working, the circuit that is activated as you're practicing is bathed in dopamine, and that makes it stronger. And that feels good. It's growth. It's part of positive emotion. And so the positive emotion moves you forward, but also encourages you to develop a habit of that practice. And so one of the things I would bloody well say is, don't make a habit of pursuing things that aren't good for you, because you build that into you. That's what happens if you become addicted to something, you know. You build a little monster inside you that's grown. It's there. It's after one goal, despite everything else. Not a good outcome. So now positive emotion also signals the fact that it's also an energy conservation observation. So as I move forward towards my goal, with each step I take, it's going to take less energy to get to the goal. And so that means that positive emotion signifies, what would you say? It signifies the increasing efficiency of your action as you move towards a goal. So negative emotion signifies the fact that things have got too complex for you to manage, and positive emotion signifies that you're approaching your goal and that there's less demand on energy output with every step forward. And so that's emotion. And that's pretty much worth knowing. And then what happens when you're watching a movie is you infer the goal of the protagonist, or the villain for that matter. You infer the goal of the character that's being portrayed on the screen. You adopt that goal as your own. Then you play out the emotions in your own body, which mimics the structure what would you call the character that's being portrayed on the screen, and you live that all out inside you. And that's also how you understand other people, right? You don't listen to someone and then figure out what they're saying and then infer what they're thinking. That isn't how it works. What you do is you listen to someone till you figure out what they're up to. As soon as you figure out what they're up to, you can adopt that frame of reference. As soon as you adopt that frame of reference, you have the same emotions. And that's what makes you united. And so that's so interesting. And so then you think, look, there's 5,000 people in here. If there were 5,000 chimpanzees, you guys would be tearing each other into shreds because no one would be able to know what anyone else was up to. But because all of you are here paying attention to the same thing in the same way, you have virtually identical emotional states, and that means instantly your behavior is rendered predictable to one another. And there's no difference between that and peace. They're the same thing. And so what that means is that one of the predicates of a civil, productive, and peaceful society is that everyone inhabits the same narrative. And you might say, well, we don't need the same narrative. It's like, yes, we do, because if we inhabit a different narrative, then we're running emotionally in different directions, and we will not understand each other, and we will run into conflict, and that conflict can become deadly at the drop of a hat. And so it's a precondition for a civil society that everyone is united in the same narrative. And then that begs the question, right? What is the narrative insofar as we're unified? And another question, which is, what should the narrative be? Right? Now, the postmodernists figured out that we looked at the world through a story, but they said their mantra is they became skeptical of meta-narratives, which are uniting narratives. And that's all well and good to be skeptical about meta-narratives, but you run into the problem of internal disunion, because if you don't have a uniting narrative, then you're divided against yourself, and you run into the problem of social disunity, because if we're not looking at the same thing for the same reason, then we can't get along. And those are big problems. Now, the way the postmodernists glided over that immense cataclysmic problem was to offer the proposition that the narrative that unites us is just one of power and oppression, right? And that the fundamental motivation that guides, first of all, even your internal organization, your own internal tyranny, you know, you're oppressing your id or your natural self. And then if you establish a relationship with someone like a marriage, well, that's just a manifestation of patriarchal oppression. And if you organize a business relationship, it's a relationship of mutual exploitation, and so far and so on, all the way up the political hierarchy, all the way back into the past. A more dismal view of human existence couldn't possibly be formulated. And I always think about it as a kind of implicit confession. It's like, so you think the world's all run by power, do you? Okay, I know what game you're playing and attempting to justify, and it's completely bloody preposterous, because first of all, if you tyrannize yourself, you're going to be one miserable creature. Plus, you're going to rebel constantly, as you already know. I'm sure all of you have tried at one time or another in your life to force yourself to do something with a whip, so to speak, and what you instantly find is that you're so condemned to be free that you'll even resist your own tyranny, right? Try telling yourself to do something and see if you do it. I'm going to go to the gym. That's New Year's. I'm going to the gym 3 times a week, 2 hours a day. It's like, no, you're not. You're going to last like 3 days. And then you're going to find an excuse. The rebellious part of you is going to find an excuse, then you're not going to do it. And it's a bloody mystery, isn't it? Because you'd think you could tell yourself what to do. Because otherwise, who are you? You know, you're the part that told yourself what to do, but you don't listen, so what the hell's that part? That's you, that's for sure. So you can't even tyrannize yourself with any efficiency. And then if you're married, men, you're married, try tyrannizing your wife and see how well that works. And like, it might work for 10 minutes, but she's not as big as you, but she's a lot sneakier. And you have to wake up with her tomorrow morning. And so even if you do win the fight, which you won't, she's going to bloody well take it out on you the next day, and no wonder. And so you're bound in that relationship by the necessity of continual iterative interactions, right? And they have to be moderately peaceful, or you're going to tear each other into shreds. And if it's constant conflict, you're both going to just exhaust yourself and die. So how the hell is that going to work? So it has to be at least mutually reinforcing. And maybe if you really got it together well, you could interact with each other in a way that improved your interactions across time. And maybe you're wise enough so that if you were on that track, the way you would experience that in the moment would be as exactly the kind of relationship you'd want to have with someone. And that would be something like the spirit of play and romantic love. And that would be the manifestation of an instinct that orients you across time properly in a relationship in the moment. And that's such a wonderful thing to know, right? That instinct for play and romantic love might be the voice of the wisest instinct you have, the deepest orientation to meaning that you have. You know, because there's nothing more delightful in a marriage or in a family, if you have children, than to be able to engage in something like voluntary play. And you know, if you could have the world set up the way you would want it to, if you had any sense, wouldn't it be something if mostly what you did was something akin to play? And that's equivalent. Christ in the Gospel says, know that unless you become like a little child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And what does that mean? It means to rediscover that intense immersion in life and that capacity for play that characterized us all as children that we can't maintain because we have to mature, but that we could rediscover as adults if we were sufficiently wise and careful. And so, and then, you know, if you have friends, it's like, well, you tyrannize your friends? Well, then you don't have friends. You're just a bully with henchmen. And as soon as you stumble, they're going to stab you in the back because you surrounded yourself with craven psychopaths. They're just going to wait for the moment to take you out. That's not a friendship, obviously. And if you're running a business, and those of you who've run businesses who have a clue know this is true, it's like, what happens if you rip off your customers? Well, you can get away with it once or twice, but word gets around in no time flat, and then you're just done and bitter and resentful because your idiot machinations didn't work. But if you engage in fair trade and you're reliable and you deliver what you promised and you're half decently good to your employees and the people that you work for, then they're going to be pleased with you, and they're going to come back and they're going to talk to their friends about how well you did, and you're going to flourish. And none of that's arbitrary. You know, that's all guided by the manifestation of a certain form of attentional priority, right? You go to your customer's house, maybe you're a plumber, and the first thing you do is you listen to their damn problem. And so at least you have enough sense to engage in dialogos, right? You actually want to hear what the problem is, and then you actually want to solve it. And if you do that with some diligence, they're going to be pleased with you because they don't want sewage all over the rug. And so your interests are aligned, and if you offer what you promise, then you're going to evoke positive emotion in them and quell their anxiety, and that's exactly the service that you're offering. And so that means you're acting out the proper story. You're productive and generous and honest, and there's nothing arbitrary about that as a ethos that unites you internally and that also makes it possible for you to exist in a peaceful and productive society.
So now you're moving towards the promised land, let's say. So that's inspiring, and that produces positive emotion, because you experience positive emotion when you see yourself moving towards a valued goal. No valued goal, no positive emotion. That's how your systems are set up psychophysiologically. On the negative front, well, maybe anger and bitterness and fear stop you. Okay, so what do you do with them? Take good stock of your sinful nature, let's say. You know what temptations you're prone to and what knock you off the beaten track, and maybe you feel guilty about it. You know where your weaknesses are, and you probably have some idea of just what kind of hell you could inhabit if you let those weaknesses get the upper hand. So why don't you just write about that for 15 minutes? So let's say this isn't what you could have in 5 years. It's the pit you could dig for yourself if you decided to, you know, just sit there or dig. Everyone has a sense of that, you know, for some people. My temptation probably would have been alcohol. It calmed me in social situations. It made me feel a closer kinship to people, and it was a pretty good stimulant. And so it was a really good drug for me, and I enjoyed it quite a lot, too much. But I learned that I had better things to do. I wouldn't have stopped without better things to do. And what
did you mean by better things to do?
Well, I was writing my book, Maps of Meaning, when I was still carousing as a graduate student. I'd started to put my life together by that point quite a bit, but I was still a party animal and very social. And but I found that I couldn't think hungover. And not only that, I couldn't handle the emotional tension of what I was dealing with intellectually. It was too, because, you know, if you're hungover, your emotions are more sensitive, especially your anxiety. And the work I was doing was way too demanding emotionally, because I was dealing with historical atrocity, and the motivations for that was just too damn dark, you know, to be dealing with hungover. Plus, once I had written a fair bit and was editing, once you've edited your work to a substantial degree, you have to use finer and finer gradations of judgment to continue to improve it. And if you're fuzzy-minded at all, if you've impaired your judgment, when you edit, you can make it worse, not better. And then I also realized that the only times I really regretted my actions was when I was drinking, because it disinhibits you, and that's fun. That can be really fun. But I'd wake up the next day and think, yeah, I was a little too provocative. I was a little too aggressive. I was a little too mean-spirited in my wit, a little too egotistical, or maybe more than a little on all of those fronts. A little careless in my choice of partner. A little uncontrolled in my social behavior in places I shouldn't have been, because, you know, I was starting to, well, I was a graduate student and a teacher by that point, and I was interacting with professors, say, in the social milieu.
Responsibility grew.
Yeah, well, it wasn't the time to be drunk. That just wasn't good. That worked in northern Alberta to some degree in some subcultures, but in those situations, it just made me look like a fool. Well, it made me into a fool, not just look like one. And then when you and I got married, I didn't, and we were going to have kids. I thought, well, I'm not drinking until I have kids.
Yeah, I wanted children.
Yeah, and you know, you want to grow up at that point. And besides, I was ready to dispense with all of that by then. In any case, so you can imagine the hell you could inhabit. And then the advantage to that is, see, people are often afraid of moving forward, and no wonder. But you should be way more afraid of not moving forward. And so if you get that hell behind you, it's like, well, do I want to go there? Well, I don't have the effort or the energy. I'm not even sure that it's the right thing. It's like, well, do I want to go back there? It's like, no, definitely not that. And if you don't feel that, if you don't feel that hell, then you're not nearly as motivated as you could be. Because if you have any sense of just exactly how bloody dismal and dark things could get, then, and that's right there for you. And that was one thing that...
I thought it was helpful. I thought it was helpful when I did the future authoring to think about where I would go if I went to the wrong place.
Why?
Well, it's just good to know how you will fall apart.
Yeah, well,
And
then
it's
you
possible.
Well, and you can also ask yourself, and studying historical atrocity also helped me with that. It's like, well, do you want to be a, what would you call a sadist? You're bitter and resentful. You want to hurt other people? Is that where you want to end up? You want to lie and deceive? Because that's where you end up if you lie and deceive. You want to be resentful and bitter? Because that's where you end up if you're resentful and bitter.
Yeah, but sometimes, you know, people, they just don't know what to do about it. So your program helps them to make a plan.
Yeah, well, and the plan is really, look, we're visionaries, man. Human beings are visionaries. Really.
Well, I found when I did the self-authoring, the 15 minutes of writing that I did, the dreaming I did,
Yeah.
when I wrote about my future and just dreamed of what it could be like if it was just what I wanted.
Yeah.
And then outlined the goals, because you outline goals after that in the future authoring. Those things that I had identified appeared in my life. Those,
Yeah, well,
and that was quite shocking to
well,
me.
the thing is, you look at the world through a goal-directed framework, and so when you switch your goals, what appears to you in the world switches. It's mystical in a sense, but in another sense, it's just understandable. It's like, well, if I look that way, I see the TV and the couch, and if I look this way, I see you in the chair. Well, that's not that mysterious, but what I've done is I've changed the reality that manifests itself to me just by changing the direction of my orientation. Well, we do that metaphysically as well. And so, for example, if you decide that you're going to be courageously trusting towards people when they offer you an opportunity, even though you're skeptical and timid, but you decide, no, I'm going to have some faith in people, so I'm going to be courageous and trusting. Then when they open a door to you that's an opportunity, you'll think, oh, that's a door I could walk through, instead of thinking I'm moving into a trap. And it's the same reality in some sense, but the way that you're interacting with it changes. Well, it can change. It can invert. It can change so radically that it barely looks like you're living in the same world. There are a lot of potential interpretations that you can validly lay on the world, and some of them are extremely positive, and they still work. And wouldn't that be lovely if you could lay an incredibly positive vision on the world in a calculating and strategic manner, not an instrumental manner, right? Because you're aiming at something genuinely good, and that would work. And that is how the world works. One of the things I loved about my clinical practice, I loved this. It was so good, and I miss it. We're always working. The best parts of me and my client were working together to make everything about their lives better. And it worked. You know, like I had lots of female clients who tripled their income in 4 years. They didn't even think that was possible. It's like, well, I don't make enough money, I'm barely making ends meet, single mothers, I have no idea what to do, I don't like my job. It's like, well, let's make a plan here. You know, what do you want? Well, I'd like to make this much money. Why don't we double that? And just, because you're going to aim at something. Some people do make more money than that, so maybe it could be you. Well, is that even possible? It's not even possible. It's like, well, let's just assume that maybe it's possible and see what you'd have to do. Well, you got to get your CV together. Well, it's full of holes. Okay, well, let's fix the holes. Okay, now you got to get a plan. Well, I'm not very good at interviews. Okay, let's practice interviewing till you're not just good at it, you're looking forward to it. You know, I had clients who were in such dire situations that all I could do was really help buffer them against that. But they were a minority. I wouldn't say more than 5% of my practice fell into that category. Everyone else, it was like just rapid improvement on all fronts, you know. And that's such fun. And there isn't anything more practical. This is the thing too. There is nothing more practical than developing a vision. It's not some pie in the sky exercise. Without a vision, you're chaotic and fragmented and hopeless and disappointed, and someone can stop you just by putting up a single obstacle. You're a house divided amongst itself. You have no forward movement. You're not enthusiastic, and that's to be filled with the Spirit of God, by the way. And your life is a sequence of disappointments and frustrations and tragedies, and you're a leaf blowing in the wind. And that is not what you're called to be. That's not what you're called to be. You're called to be a visionary constructor of the paradise of vision. Mm-hmm. Really, that's who you are. Terrible as that is to apprehend. And so,
Well, what do we have to lose?
we already will lose everything we have to lose.
Yeah.
Right? We're all in this game, man. So there's, whether you want it to be this way or not, you are betting everything on your life.
Any advice for students here?
Yeah, read great books. Really, man. You've got this 4-year period that has been carved out of your lives by society. It's given you an identity, like a high quality identity, and freedom at the same time. And you're not going to get that again in your life. You've got a respectable identity, university student, and complete freedom associated with that, or as near as you're ever going to get. And you've got these unbelievable libraries that are full of the writings of people who are intelligent and articulate beyond comprehension. And you know, and you can go there and you can learn all this. And you might think, well, why should you learn it? Well, you learn it to get a job, or you learn it to get good grades, or you learn it to get a degree, and that's all nonsense. It's nonsense. The reason that you come to university to be educated is because there is nothing more powerful than someone who is articulate and who can think and speak. It's power, and I mean power of the best sort. It's authority and influence and respectability and competence. And so you come to university to craft your highest skill, and your highest skill is to be found in articulated speech.
And if you're a master at formulating your arguments, you win everything. And better than that, when you win everything, everyone around you wins too. Because to transform yourself into, let's consider your transformation to something approximating the logos. It means you shine a light on the whole world. Well, there's nothing more exciting to do than that. There's nothing better you can possibly do. And to think that you're coming to university to be, trained to have a job, it's like, great, that's a hell of a lot better than being unemployed and covered with Cheeto dust while you're snacking away in front of your video game in the basement. But it's not and I don't have anything against video games, by the way, but it's hardly a triumphant call to being in the world, and that's what university should be calling for. It's like, God, you people, I know what Harvard students are like. I taught here for 5 years. You people are spectacular. You're spectacular. You're all capable of being world beaters. You transform yourself into something that's articulated and sensible and grounded in history and knowledgeable and wise, man. You can do anything you want, and hopefully anything you want for good. Because if you have any sense, everything you want to do would be for the good, because there's nothing more compelling or meaningful or useful in combating the tragedy of life than to struggle with all your soul on behalf of the good. And the universities have forgotten that. It's why everyone's bailing out of the humanities, and they should. The humanities are corrupt. And they're corrupt because they're not telling students this. It's so bloody obvious. It's like, learn to think, learn to speak, learn to read. It makes you a superpower, an individual superpower. I don't understand why that isn't just told to students. It's not that hard to understand, and everyone wants to hear it. It's like, really? I could do that? I could do that? It's like, yeah, really, you could do that. And the whole society around you has labored for really thousands of years to provide every single one of you with this spectacular opportunity that you have while you're undergraduates and graduate students here, man. Everyone's just praying that you would come here and manifest everything that you could manifest. And that's what you should be doing, instead of waving placards and complaining about how you're oppressed, for God's sake. You see these Yale students complaining about their oppression. It just leaves me aghast. It's like, well, we're against the ruling class. It's like, no, you're baby ruling class members. You're young. The only reason you're not rich is because you're young. That's the best. Really, if you look at the 1% even, the dreaded 1%, most of those people are old. Why? Well, when you progress through life, if you're reasonably successful, you trade in your promising youth for your wealthy old age, but you're still bloody old. Would you trade it? Would you trade your youth for that? Like, if you factor age out of the economic equation, things look a lot different. Well, of course older people have more money. If they have any sense, they've been collecting it for their whole life. Is that somehow unfair? It's not unfair unless you want to be poverty-stricken when you're 70, and you don't want to be poverty-stricken when you're 70. So I just don't understand what's happened to the universities. I can't believe that you're not told when you come the first day, look, man, you're here on a heroic mission. You're going to take your capacity to articulate yourself to levels that are undreamed of. You're going to come out of here unstoppable. You're going to be able to do anything you want. It's like, that's what you're here for. Instead, you're taught that, well, the world's a pretty oppressive place, and you're probably the bottom of the victim pile, and there's virtually nothing you can do about it except, deconstruct the patriarchy. And it's so weak-kneed and so pathetic that universities should be embarrassed that that's what they're peddling to students. I'm embarrassed by it. I've gone on public record telling parents, bloody well send your boys to trade school, because at least they'll learn something useful. And that's a terrible thing for someone like me to say, because I do believe that being articulated and educated in the highest possible manner there's nothing that's better for you and for society. And why have the universities forgotten this? Well, that's postmodern neo-Marxism for you, and the philosophy of intense resentment and oppression and group identity, and God, it's just pathetic.
Dr. Peterson, I think a lot of students here would agree with you that one of the main purposes of education at college, particularly at Harvard, is to develop their sense of articulation, their ability to read, their ability to critically think. But then what comes after? Particularly at Harvard, there's a big discussion on what is a good life? What does it mean to use those skills that we get here and then we graduate, what do we do from there?
Stop unnecessary suffering. That's what you do. You know, that's your calling. It's like you say, well, what do you do after you graduate? Well, if you graduate articulated and powerful, there will be people giving you so many opportunities you won't even be able to keep up with them. You know, I've worked with very, very competent people in many different domains in my life, hyper-competent people. And I can tell you some very interesting things about hyper-competent people. The first thing is they are not selfish and they're not greedy. And one of the great pleasures in their lives is to find people who have the capacity to also be hyper-competent and to open doors for them as rapidly as they can possibly be opened. They delight in that because there's very few things that are more intrinsically meaningful if you're an accomplished person than to find young people who have the possibility of being accomplished and say, hey, look, here's an opportunity for you. It's like, go out there, man, kill it. And then they go out there and kill it, and you think, right on, man. Here's another opportunity. Why don't you go out there and nail that too? And you think, no, they're all hoarding their wealth and they're not going to share it with anyone. It's like, that's absolute, complete rubbish. And so you don't even have to worry about what you're going to do after you graduate from here if you turn yourself into half of what you could be, because people will be dying to offer you every opportunity that you can possibly make use of. So it's a moot point. The world is always desperately short of people who can think and speak. And you think, well, I won't be made use of. Well, first of all, you can't say that if you're at Harvard, for God's sake. I mean, people already figured out who you are. They've already figured it out. And they're offering you the world on a gold platter. They take it. It's yours. Take it. It's like, great, man. Put yourself together and deserve it. That would be great. And that's what everyone wants. It's what your parents want. It's also what you want. You know it. It's what you want. It's what women want from men. It's what men want from women. It's like for you to be who you could be. And the highest faculty of the human being is articulated speech. It's the divine faculty. And there is nothing more powerful than that. There's nothing that's even in the same league. And so if you don't have faith in that, then your priorities are misplaced. And I can't even understand why you wouldn't have faith in that being, say, Harvard students, because look where it's got you already. You know, you're already sitting on top of the world. So deserve it, make use of it. Right? Go out there and fix things up. That's what you need to do. There's lots of things that need to be fixed up. And what you want to do is burden yourself with so much responsibility that you can barely stand. And then you'll get stronger trying to lift it up. And you won't be asking, what should I be doing with my life? Or what's the meaning of life? Or any of that. It'll be self-evident. It's self-evident. At minimum, you can say, there's more suffering in the world than there should be. And I could probably do something about that. And you can do something about that. So go do something about it. And then there'll be less suffering in the world. And then when you're 80, you can look back on your life and say, well, you know, there's less suffering in the world than there would have been had I not existed. And you don't have to even have a sense of ultimate destiny or even any sort of theistic belief to regard that as a positive good. Like, I think it goes beyond the mere pragmatic utility of addressing the world's ills, because I think we do live in a world that has a transcendent reality as well as the reality that we can detect. But even independently of that, it doesn't matter. It's like, I mean, this is part of the reason I like people like Bill Gates is a great example, man. That guy he's after 5 major diseases at the same time, right? He's trying to wipe out polio. He's trying to wipe out malaria. Yeah, exactly. He's trying to wipe out malaria. It's like, well, what should you do with your life? Well, you know, take a look at Bill Gates and see if you could do something like that. That would be good. There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much, well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day.
You're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them because they're not like you. You know, they don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win. Be careful who you share good news with, because you want to share good news with people who are going to be genuinely happy for you, and that's one way that you can identify those people who are really on your side. Be careful who you share bad news with, because that's equally tricky. You know, you want someone who will listen to you when you're having trouble and allow you your grief, especially if it's a consequence of something tragic, and who won't try to one-up you, you know, because often when you're talking to people, they'll be thinking about what they have to say that's worse, and that's not helpful if you need a listening ear. Make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. I talked a lot already about the necessity of cleaning your room, which is, you know, in some sense a foolish piece of advice because it seems so obvious, but it's not obvious at all. And you'll find if you try it, especially if you're in a household that's not very functional, that you'll encounter obstacles that you couldn't imagine existed while you're trying to put your life in order. And you can take your surroundings beyond order and move towards beauty, and that's unbelievably useful. One of the things that I've been you know, there's lots of different ways to interpret the world, and you can maybe even make a case that there's an endless number of ways to interpret the world. And the problem with that is that it kind of disorients you in terms of what you should be doing. But just because there's a very large number of ways to interpret the world doesn't mean there's a very large number of productive, meaningful, and sustainable ways to interpret the world. And one of the things you do have to do is figure out how you can conduct yourself today so that you don't upset the apple cart in a week or a month or a year. And so, you know, what you do in some sense psychologically is you admit to yourself that your current frame of reference is faulty. Mm-hmm. And then you start opening the door to a different kind of thinking, which is more creative thinking. It's more lateral thinking. Saying, well, I'm wrong, but that's not necessarily a problem because I could be right if I thought some other way. Well, you know, that's great. Often it works.
Yeah.
And there's almost no end to the utility of trying to figure out which ways that you're wrong.
Yeah.
Because there's lots of them. And every time you discover one, then you don't have to be quite so wrong anymore. That's a really good deal.
Yeah.
It's from the uphill climb that we derive our value, and I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, you want a goal that you can never attain. So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal, but then you think, now I'm there, now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave the face. What do you want to be, a giant infant with a gold bottle? You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck. It's like, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand. And that's dynamic, that's exciting. Lay a disciplinary structure on yourself. Get the chaos in check. And then you can move towards a state that's freer. It's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. And so virtually every freedom that you have in life that's true freedom is purchased at the price of discipline. That it's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you as in need of repair, that you could repair, then hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. Now, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial. You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do, hands down. People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure, because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. What, do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle, and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile. The great people I know are brutally truthful to themselves and other people, and they have insanely adventurous lives. Get rid of everything you say that you only say to impress other people, and just see if you can say what you believe to be true. That's an adventure. That's the thing about the truth, you know? Well, you got to ask yourself, if you're not speaking the truth, who is it that's talking? If you're saying something that you do not believe to be true, it's not you talking. It's something else. It might be the part of you that wants to manipulate the other person into delivering what you think you want from them. Well, what is that spirit of manipulation that you've allowed to possess you? It's not you. Let's say you decide to live your whole life in that instrumental manner. You're going to craft your words like the student who says, well, I'm going to write what the professor wants to hear so I get the grade. It's like, well, you just turn yourself into that. Well, who is it that's doing that manipulating? It's not you, because those aren't your words.
So even if you get the grade, it's not you that got the grade, it's the false you, it's the manipulative you. So you do that your whole life, you don't have your life. And then you think, well, God, that was a miserable life. I manipulated everybody, they were so damn stupid, they were sucked in by it, they're all contemptible. Everyone does it, you know, which they don't, by the way. And so that's a pathway to bitterness. Partly because if you're a manipulator and you use your language falsely, you don't live your own life. You live the life of whatever possesses you when you think it's you manipulating. And so you live the life of the spirit of manipulation.
You know, maybe you're in California, see someone speeding down the road in a convertible Porsche, and you think, oh man, what a lucky bastard. And the truth of the matter is that he's thinking about wrapping his expensive sports car around the next cement pillar that he comes close to. You know, you can't tell. And people have hard lives, and even people who are comparatively fortunate have hard lives. And the ideal that you're observing that makes you jealous and resentful is in large part an illusion that's created by your own mind. You have to be careful of what you're jealous of because you don't really know what it is. And then the other thing that's kind of useful is to understand you're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them because they're not like you. They don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you.
If you gave 1,000 people a list of adjectives to describe themselves with, and one of the adjectives was happy, and another of the adjectives was social, you'd find that those who rated themselves high on happy would also rate themselves high on social, and those who rated themselves low on happy would also rate themselves low on social. And by looking at those patterns of covariation, you can determine what the essential dimensions are of human personality. One of the dimensions is roughly happiness. That's extroversion. Another dimension is neuroticism. It's a negative emotion dimension. So if you ask someone if they're anxious and they score high, say on a scale of 1 to 7, they're also likely to score high on another item that says that they're sad. And it turns out that negative emotions clump together, and so that people who experience more of one negative emotion have a propensity to experience more of all of them. There's another dimension called agreeableness, and agreeable people are self-sacrificing, compassionate, and polite. If you're dealing with an agreeable person, they don't like conflict. They care for other people. If you're dealing with an agreeable person, they're likely to put your concerns ahead of theirs. They're non-competitive and cooperative. It's a dimension where women score more highly than men on agreeableness across cultures, including those cultures where the largest steps have been taken towards producing an egalitarian social circumstance, like Scandinavia. Actually, the gender differences in personality there are larger than they are anywhere else. Another trait is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is an excellent trait if you want to do well in school and in work, especially if you're a manager and administrator. I can't say we understand a lot about conscientiousness, although it reliably emerges from factor analytic studies of adjective groups across different countries. Conscientious people are diligent, industrious, and orderly. Their orderliness tilts them towards political conservatism, by the way, because it turns out that your inbuilt temperament, your inbuilt personality, which constitutes a set of filters through which you view the world, also alters the manner in which you process information and influences the way that you vote. And so you might say, and I do believe that this is true, we've been doing a lot of research on this as of late, the more accurate a measure you take of someone's political beliefs, the more you find that personality is what's predicting them. And I think that's a reasonable thing to think about, because you have to figure out ways of simplifying the world, right? Because you just can't do everything. And so people are specialized. They have specialized niches that they occupy. You could think about them as social niches. Like a niche is a place where your particular skills would serve to maintain you
And so if you're extroverted, you're going to look for a social niche because you like to be around people. And if you're introverted, you're going to spend much more time on your own. And so if you're an introverted person, for example, you're going to want a job where you're not selling and where you're not surrounded by groups of people who are making social demands on you all the time, because it'll wear you out. Whereas if you're extroverted, that's just exactly what you want. And so the extrovert sees the world as a place of social opportunity, and the introvert sees the world as a place to retreat from and spend time alone. And it turns out that both of those modes of being are valid. The issue, at least to some degree, is whether or not you're fortunate enough to match your temperament with the demands of the environment, and I suppose also whether you're fortunate enough so that you're born in an era where there actually is a niche for your particular temperament, because it isn't necessarily the case that that will be the case. Imagine that all of these temperamental dimensions vary because of evolutionary pressure, right? So there's a distribution of extroversion, a normal distribution. Most people are somewhere in the middle, and then as you go out towards the extremes, there are fewer and fewer people. And what that means is that on average, across large spans of time, there have been environments that match every single position on that distribution, with most of the environments matching the center, because otherwise we wouldn't have evolved that way. And so sometimes being really extroverted is going to work well for you in a minority of environments, a minority of niches, and sometimes it's just going to be a catastrophe. I suspect, for example, that if you live in a tyrannical society where any sign of personally oriented activity is likely to get you in trouble, that being extroverted and low in neuroticism wouldn't be a very good idea, because you're going to be mouthy and happy and saying a lot of things, unable to keep your thoughts to yourself, and you're going to be relatively fearless. Now, I don't know that for sure, because we haven't done the studies that precisely match temperamental proclivity to environmental demand, but you get what I mean. So conscientious people, anyways, conscientious people are industrious and orderly. We know a little bit about orderliness. It seems to be associated, strangely enough, with disgust sensitivity, which I suppose isn't that surprising. You know, if you take an orderly person and you put them in a messy kitchen, they respond with disgust and want nothing more than to straighten it all out and organize it and clean it. And there's tremendous variability in orderliness. And as I said, orderliness predicts political conservatism. It's not the only thing, but it's certainly one of the things. The correlation between conscientiousness and grades is about 0.4. It's about 16% of the variance. It's the second best predictor of university grades after intelligence. We'll talk about intelligence during this course too. Intelligence is actually a relatively straightforward concept. I don't think I'll get into it today, but conscientious people, their industriousness and their orderliness makes them schedule their time. So they make efficient use of their time. They use schedules and that sort of thing. We haven't been able to figure out anything about the underlying biology or psychology of industriousness. We've tried really dozens and dozens of tests attempting to find a laboratory measure on which industrious people do better, and we failed completely. And there's no animal models of industriousness either. And so I would say it's a great mystery that remains at the heart of trait psychology. And maybe it's a human-specific category, you know. I mean, you can think of sled dogs maybe of being industrious, and maybe sheepdogs and animals that work like that, but of course they've been trained by human beings. So, but it isn't obvious that animals are industrious the same way we are. I mean, industriousness involves sacrificing the present for the future, something like that. And it seems like you have to be able to conceptualize time in order to sacrifice the present for the future. One of the things that I would recommend that you do as students in this course, and maybe in every course, speaking of industriousness, is come up with a plan of attack for the course and use a scheduler. You know, if you treat your university career like a full-time job, you're much more likely to succeed. And if you keep up on the readings and you keep up on the essays and all of that, then you're much less likely as well to fall into despair when you get too far behind. Using a Google Calendar or something like that to organize a schedule for the entire semester at the beginning of the semester can be invaluable, especially if you're not very industrious, because it can keep you on track. And one of the things we know about industrious people is that they are very good at using schedules and at planning the use of their time. And so I would like to say that you should all be smarter, but I don't know how you could be smarter. We don't know anything about how to improve intelligence, and I suppose we don't really know anything about how to improve industriousness either, but I can tell you that people who are industrious come up with a strategy for solving the problem that's ahead of them, and then they do whatever they can to stick to the strategy. And so, for example, if you sat down today or tomorrow for a couple of hours, 3 hours, and you filled in a Google Calendar, whatever you happen to use, with a strategy for studying and a list of when all your assignments are due and all of that, and when you're going to sit down and study, then you won't be in a position where you have to cram for 10 hours a day hopelessly right before, you know, an important exam. It's also a very ineffective way of studying, by the way. I mean, first of all, people who cram for 10 hours say they're studying for 10 hours, but they rarely are because, well, I can't study for 10 hours. I don't have the power of concentration that would enable me to do that for that prolonged period of time. I can manage about 3 hours of intense intellectual activity before I'm pretty done. And it's also the case that if you study and then sleep and then study and then sleep and then study and then sleep, you space it out, then you're much more likely to remember. It's also much more likely that you're much more likely to remember if you try to recall the material. And so highlighting and that sort of thing isn't very useful, but reading, closing the book, summarizing what you've read without opening the damn book, that's useful. And the reason for that is that you're practicing remembering. And that's what you have to practice. If you're practicing memorization, you have to practice remembering. You don't just go over the thing over and over. That'll help you with recognition memory, but it won't help you with recall memory. Anyways, the last trait is openness. Openness is a creativity trait. It's also associated with intelligence, in that intelligent people, and I'm speaking technically of IQ, tend to be higher and tend to be more creative, which is hardly surprising. Creative people are more likely to be liberal politically, by the way. They like novelty, they like aesthetics, they like fiction, they like movies, they like art, they like poetry. There's something about them that grants them an aesthetic sensitivity, and that's an inbuilt trait. And it's not the case, by the way, that everyone's creative. In fact, far from it. We've used the Creative Achievement Questionnaire to measure people's creativity. I'll talk to you about that later in the class. And the Creative Achievement Questionnaire takes 13 dimensions of creativity. So, you know, writing, dancing, acting, scientific investigation, entrepreneurial activity, architectural activity, cooking, there's a handful of others, singing, etc. You know, the sorts of things that you would assume that people could be creative about. And then it asks people to rate themselves on a scale from 1 to 10 on their level of achievement with regards to all those creative domains, with 0 being I have no training or proficiency in this area, and 70% of people score 0 across the entire Creative Achievement Questionnaire. A tiny proportion of people are outliers, way out, and they're creative in many dimensions simultaneously and exceptionally creative. And it turns out, as you'll find out, that pattern, which is called a Pareto distribution, where most people stack up at 0 and a few people are way out on the creative end, characterizes all sorts of distributions, like the distribution of money, for example, which is why 1% of the people have the overwhelming majority of the money. It's a different 1% across time. It churns, and you're much more likely to be in the 1% if you're older, logically enough, because one of the things you do as you age is you trade youth for money, if you're fortunate. I don't think the trade is really worth it, but that's the best you've got. So anyways, those particular traits, you can think of those as ways that you simplify the world, right? There's lots of different places that you can act in the world, and there's lots of different ways you can look at it and survive. That's why you can be a plumber and a lawyer and an engineer, and those all work, right? Even though they're very different modes of being. And you can have different personalities and survive, as long as you're capable of finding the place where your particular filters and behavioral proclivities match the demand of the environment. And a huge part, I would say, of successful adaptation is precisely that. There's a difference between attention and thinking. Let me give you an example. So thinking seems to be instrumental, mostly. People also often say to me, well, what's your strategy when you go into an interview? And the answer is, well, I don't have a strategy when I go into an interview because I'm there to have a conversation. And I'm not sure where the conversation will go, and I'm willing to let it go wherever it goes. I'm not there to sell books, although I'm perfectly happy if more books sell, because obviously I wrote a book and I want people to read it, and there's a whole enterprise behind it, and so it's also my responsibility to do the marketing properly. But I'm not going to do these interviews to sell books or to promote myself, or I don't have a strategic goal in mind, except that I'm going to have a conversation and I'm going to say what I think and take the consequences, because I assume that if I say something and I believe it's true, then the consequences are as positive as they can be, regardless of how they look at the time. And that's an issue of faith, because I believe that the habitable order is generated by spoken truth. I believe that. I think that's the truest thing I know. And so I go into the interview, and I did this in my clinical practice, and I try to do this when I'm talking to people too, is that I'm not thinking about where the conversation is going or what point I want to make or what I want the outcome to be. Any of that, I just let that go. You know, it's within this broader framework of assuming that the truth is the most effective means of progressing. And then I pay attention. And what happens when you pay attention is that while you're watching a person, this is a great treatment for social anxiety, by the way, because if you're socially anxious, you tend not to pay attention to the person. Pay attention to who you're talking to. Watch them like a hawk, like not paranoid or anything like that, and not too intently because you make them uncomfortable, but intently. Pay attention to what they're saying, to how they look, to their facial gestures, all of that. Look at their face and watch and listen and try to understand what they're saying. And what you'll see is that, well, questions pop into your mind. It's like, well, I didn't understand what you said. Can you clarify that? And it sounds like you mean this. Is this what you mean? But not in a, I'll put you on the spot because I think you're wrong sort of way, but in a clarification sort of way. And all of that's attention. And so when I'm doing clinical work with people, and this is the reason I quit, by the way, about a year ago, is because I was starting to get distracted. I had a rule, which was, you have an hour with me and I do nothing but pay attention to you. I'm not thinking about what I want to accomplish. I'm not thinking about the problems in my life. I'm not distracted. And I listen to you and I ask questions when I don't understand. And if a thought occurs to me while I'm paying attention to you, then I'll tell you what it is. You see, and that's using awareness primarily and thinking secondarily. Like, I don't think, well, here's how I want to cure this person and I'm going to maneuver them into certain responses by using these communicative tools. I think I'm going to pay attention to this person. We're going to discuss where we're going and why. I'm going to listen to what they say. And then when they're talking, things are going to occur within me. I'm going to see images and thoughts are going to emerge from the background, and then I'll share them. Not always, because I usually have more thoughts than can be shared, but if a thought comes up and it seems like an interesting reaction to what the person just said, then I'll just tell them, and sort of without commitment to it. And it's usually, okay, you just said this, and so this question emerged, so we need to straighten that out because I'm confused. Or you said this and I had this image, or you said this and this thought came to mind. So that's one person's reaction to the way that you're conducting yourself at the moment. So thinking is instrumental. I outlined this in, I think it's rule 7, do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. If you do what's expedient, you have a short-term conscious goal in mind and you try to bend everything towards that end. But if you're pursuing what's meaningful, then you just pay attention to what's going on and you react with truth. And I think that's a much better way of living as far as I'm concerned. It's a much more powerful way of living. It means you have to confront things right then and there, which is, I suppose, why so many of my interviews have been, in some sense, confrontational, because people will impose a thinking agenda on the flow of the conversation. This is especially true in the mainstream media. It happened again recently with BBC's Hard Talk.
they impose an agenda on the conversation, and then that just doesn't work out very well because I'm paying attention and I will object to the agenda. Not because I have a different agenda, except for what I said, which is that I want to say what I think. I want to say as truthfully as I can what I actually am thinking in this more abstracted and detached sense, and see what happens. So it's a hard thing to clarify, because you might say, well, Dr. Peterson, you just said you want to say what you're thinking, but it's not exactly the same thing. It's not like I'm thinking strategically. I'm listening, thoughts emerge, and I say them. I'm not putting spin on things. I'm not trying to manipulate the conversation in any particular way. And again, the reason for that is because I decided a long time ago, probably 30 years, that there was no more effective way of dealing with a complex situation than to try to say what you believe to be true and not to manipulate it. None of that, because those are all lies as far as I'm concerned, that kind of manipulation and spin. If you are an anxious person and that's manifesting itself in, say, neurotic overanalysis, there's 4 things you can do very rapidly. Number 1, get up at the same time every day. And I would recommend in the mornings. That's when people generally get up, and it's good to do what everyone else does unless you have a good reason not to. Number 2, eat a large breakfast. Keep it carbohydrate light. Make it fat and protein heavy, and eat more than you want. You might say, I'm not hungry in the morning. It's like, this has nothing to do with what you want or what your appetite is. It's like, you need to eat in the morning. If you're an anxious person and you don't eat in the morning and then you stress yourself out, your body hyperproduces insulin. It takes all the blood sugar out of your blood, and that dysregulates your metabolism for the entire day. I've had lots of anxious clients who would say fall into the overanalytic category, who were like virtually cured by eating a large breakfast every morning. You could try some physical exercise. Weightlifting is really good for curing anxiety. Another thing you could do, as I alluded to earlier today, is to make a schedule and start attending to your daily micro routines.
You say you are morally obligated to do remarkable things. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, I think partly because life is so difficult and challenging that unless you give it everything you have, the chances are very high that it will embitter you, and then you'll be a force for darkness and not good. And so, the fact that life is short and can be brutal can terrify you into hiding and avoiding. You can flip that on its head and understand that since you're all in anyways, you might as well take the risks that are adventurous. There isn't anything more adventurous than the truth. So why is that a moral obligation? Well, if you hide and you don't let what's inside of you out, and you don't bring into the world what you could bring, and you become cynical and bitter, you will start doing very dark things. Not only will you not add to the world what you could add, but you'll start being jealous of people who are competent and doing well and work to destroy them. So that's the pathway to hell, really. We need to separate out the distinction between fantasy and delusion. You do have a fantasy about the future. So you have to provisionally map the future. That's what a plan is. That doesn't make it a delusion. Like, it becomes a delusion when the map bears no relationship to the underlying territory. So if you have a strategy for the future, maybe let's say that your strategy for the future is that you have 5 million YouTube subscribers in 3 years. Well, you have no evidence of the strict sort that that's how it's going to be, because anything could happen between now and 3 years from now, let's say. But there's no reason to call that a delusion. It's one hypothetically possible path of potential, and then you can make the sacrifices necessary to bring that about. So even though it's a fantasy because it maps something that isn't there, it's not a delusion. It's a delusion when you're ignoring elements of your own experience that would inform your fantasy more effectively. You're ignoring them so that you can live in a positive representation of the future without having to pay the appropriate price for it. The ultimate ideal is also the ultimate judge, because the ultimate ideal is something against which you fall far short.
And that might be so painful that you can barely stand it. But then what you do is two things, I suppose, is you lower the ideal and you raise your estimation of your potential. And what do I mean by lower the ideal? Well, if you're comparing yourself to someone or even to a future self, and the gap is so painful that it paralyzes you, then you've created a dragon that you don't have the tools to master. And so what you have to do is you have to scale the dragon down to size. And you want to scale the dragon down to size until it's a size that you are willing to move toward, however small that is. Now, you know, if you're here and your ideal is here and that gap is unbearable, then you reduce the gap and you reduce the gap. And you're going to have to do that anyways, because you're not going to move from where you are to perfect in one fell swoop, right? There's going to be incremental steps. So you have to fill in that hierarchy of progression with a high enough resolution representation so that you can start to move forward. There's another gospel comment that's very interesting. It's called the Matthew principle. And the Matthew principle is, to those who have everything, more will be given. And from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. Now, it's brutal because it implies that reality works like this. When you're moving up, you go like this, right? And that's pretty nice. That's a lot better than this. But when you're going down, you go like that, right? It's like downhill, cliff. Okay, so you want to avoid the downhill path. Well, if the uphill path is like this, which is like exponential, let's say, or geometric, then what that means is that it doesn't matter how big the first steps you take uphill are, even if they're trivial, even if they're shameful in their size, because you're so useless. If you're disciplined in that, you'll speed up extraordinarily rapidly. And so that's the good news, you might say, is that you can take very small steps, even ones that might be shameful in their size, and you have to admit that to yourself. But once you get the ball rolling, it doesn't roll in a linear fashion, it rolls in a geometric fashion. And this is a really good thing to know, because it can take the sting out of the realization of your own stupidity. It's like, yeah, you know, everybody has their weak sides, let's say, things they're embarrassed about. When I first started going to the gym, I was like 23, and I think I weighed 135 pounds, and I was 6'1", very, very thin, 27-inch waist, something like that. And I smoked like mad, and I drank too much. Like, I wasn't in good shape. The first attempts forward I took in the gym, I went to this swimsuit class. Jesus, it was me and this like really fat guy, young guy, probably not in any worse shape than me, and like 7 old women over 70, and they could outswim me. Like, it was pretty damn humiliating. And so I did a semester of that and got myself in somewhat better shape. And then I started to go to the gym to work out, to lift weights. And that was also rough because, you know, I'd be underneath the bloody bench press trying to lift 75 pounds off the rests. And, you know, some muscle-headed bastard would come over and tell me how to do it. And it's like, yeah, thank you. But you know, it's embarrassing, and lots of times people won't do things like go to the gym because they're so embarrassed about how they look or what sort of shape they're in. And it's a pain to start at the bottom, but you start at the bottom where you're weak. And if you want to rectify what's weak, you have to accept the fact that you're at the bottom and that the first steps are going to be painful. You know, it took me about 3 years, but I stopped smoking, and then I stopped drinking, and I gained 40 pounds of muscle in like 3.5 years, something like that. I basically had to stop doing that because I had to eat like 6 times a day. It was crazy. But I got a lot more physically confident and a lot more coordinated. But the point of all this is, if you're going to rectify your weaknesses, you have to admit your insufficiency to your own shame. Now, if the gap between you and your ideal is so great that it paralyzes you, you shrink that. Things will beckon to you and call to you, and you'll have intuitions about which pathway to take. And you will, in all likelihood, follow those, because what else do you have? You have these orienting instincts. This is another reason why you don't lie. Because if you lie and you practice lying, you pathologize your instincts. And then your intuitions lead you wrong. You don't want to lie because you program yourself falsely, and then you automatically see what isn't there.
And then, of course, the world will slap you in the face continually, and you'll think, oh my God, the world's such a pathological place. When the truth of the matter is that, no, you just keep running into things that you refuse to see. And then you think, well, the world's made of nothing but obstacles. It's like, well, you put the obstacles in your own path, and you did that by developing these complex, self-serving delusions, a story that you tell other people about who you are that isn't true. You're trying to lay out a map that bears no relationship to reality, and you keep wondering why you wander off the path and into a pit. It's like, well, how could it be otherwise? People have commented to me many times about my bravery, and I don't like that. It's not right. I'm afraid of different things than the typical person. Maybe that's a good way of thinking about it. I'm way more afraid of the consequences of saying something that's false or wandering off the appropriate path than I am of whatever consequences might come for saying what I believe and doing what I believe to be the case. I'm way more afraid of that. You know, I've been reading the Gospel of St. Matthew. I'm writing a book at the moment called We Who Wrestle with God, and one of the things Christ says to people continually is to not damage their vision, is to not put, that's the best way of putting it, don't occlude your eye. You can see what's in front of you if you're willing to see it. And if you're willing to see it, many of the terrible obstacles in life you can just walk around. But if you blind yourself purposefully to follow your own narrow, self-serving delusion, you're going to run into terrible things and terrible people and the terrible part of your own soul all the time. That's what you should be afraid of. You can't be isolated, alone, without responsibility and pursuing your hedonistic nonsense and not be insane and miserable. Those are all the same thing, right? And so, you know, it's got to the point, I've said things that have made me somewhat unpopular, like it's very difficult for people to mature until they have a child. You find a huge part of what you are in that relationship. It makes you responsible, makes you grow up. It gives you the opportunity to mentor someone. You have someone around who's more important than you. Well, that's part of being mentally healthy. It's a huge part of it. This enterprise that I've helped put together, Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, we're trying to put forward a model of governance. It's called a subsidiary model, and the idea is that people have multiple social roles that scale. No, there's you. You should take care of yourself, integrate yourself, which means you can conduct yourself properly across the medium to long run. You're self-sustaining. Then you can maybe extend that to your partner, and then to your family, and then to your local community, and then to broader communities as you become more and more competent and able to take on that responsibility. That's the alternative to isolated hedonic slavery. You slave to your own whims, and it's the alternative to tyranny, because if you take on all that responsibility, you don't have any need for someone to govern you. It's truly the case that your sanity is the concordance between you as an individual and the world. That's the sanity. You're distributed out into the world, and you should be, and that's, you want to be. That's where the adventure is. You want to be solipsistic? The solipsistic porn masturbator. Jesus, it's no wonder you'd be aimless and miserable. Well, God, it's so pathetic. Why am I so unhappy? It's because you think about yourself. Oh, no, you think about the lowest impulses in yourself all the time. That's why you're miserable. People exist in a sacrificial relationship to the world. What does that mean? It seems to mean something like human beings are aware of their extended self. You know you're going to be around tomorrow and next week and next month and next year and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. Now it's less certain as you go out, but you do have the sense of yourself as something that stretches across the decades. Okay, and so what that means is that you have to conduct yourself in a manner that isn't merely immediate. You have to conduct yourself in a manner that will work across time. Now, how do people do that? They work. Work is a sacrificial gesture. So you work, by definition, virtually. Work is the sacrifice of the present for the future. I mean, maybe someone can come up with a better definition of work than that, but I don't think so. It's like you put in time and effort right now, even if it's something not what you'd like to be doing at the moment. You put in time and effort because you believe. What the hell does that mean? You believe it'll pay off. Well, is that a contract with the future? Is it a covenant? Because the relationship that the biblical corpus characterizes human striving is covenantal. It's a bargain. The bargain is you make the right sacrifices and they pay off. That's the bargain. Now, you might say, well, that's just part of the social contract, but the biblical corpus insists that it's deeper than that. It's built into the structure of reality itself. And that if you got the sacrifices right, the future would be paradisal. That's a kind of sacrifice right there, is that you're willing to sacrifice your short-term physiological and psychological comfort for a medium to long-term benefit. It's the essence of sacrifice. This is something the atheists don't understand about the biblical narrative, is that the narrative insists that we live in a sacrificial relationship. It's the essence of humanity to live in a sacrificial relationship. It's like, well, is that true or not? Well, as you mature, your relationships are more sacrificial. It's less about what you, in your narrow sense, want right now, and it's more about what's good over the medium to long run, including other people. Well, that's a sacrificial relationship. Now, the covenant, and this is a matter of faith. It's the matter of the deepest faith. Are you willing to act out the proposition that the way to make the world reveal its will suffice? There's technically two different forms of reward. There's consumatory reward. That's what an orgasm is. It's consumatory reward. It brings the behavioral and perceptual sequence to a halt. It ends it, right? At the climax, it ends it. But then it's over. That journey is over, right? Then there's the dopaminergic reward, and dopaminergic reward is evidence of advancement towards a goal, right? Okay, so there's a corollary to that. Well, how do you become optimally engaged? Because dopamine facilitates engagement and focus, which is why drugs like amphetamines can be used for kids who are attention deficit disorder. You tap up the dopamine response, they lock on, right? Okay, so they're locking on to a goal-directed pursuit. The problem with amphetamines is that they can lock you on so hard you can't get out of the frame. So like kids on amphetamines will obsess, for example, about cleaning up their closet. They can't switch to the next activity. Okay, dopaminergic reward is reward that's accrued in relationship to a goal. Okay, so what's an implication of that? Well, pursue the highest possible goal. Well, why? Because the kick from advancement is higher. Now, you have to balance that. It can't be, you have to advance, right? Because imagine the reward's got two components. Number one is you're moving towards something valuable. Okay, so you want it to be as valuable as possible. Okay, but you have to be moving. You need something extremely valuable that you can move towards. Okay, so part of the reason that you establish a relationship with God, let's say, is because that's what sets the upper bound to your vision. It's like, I want things to be the best they could be. That's a vision of paradise. Well, that has to be fractionated into, your proximal decisions, but lurking behind that should be this continual movement towards, what would you say, a heaven that recedes as you approach it. That's the proper vision of heaven. A heaven is a place that's perfect and getting better, both at the same time. That's what music shows you, because a great piece of music is perfect, but it's just getting better as it unfolds. And you need that. This is part of the problem with a static utopian vision, something Dostoevsky criticized. If you gave people nothing but consumatory reward, he famously says, so that they can do nothing but sit in tubs of hot water, eat cake, and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, human beings would break that all to hell in a moment just so they have something interesting to do. If you run yourself through a disciplinary process, so you accomplish something, maybe you don't attain the goal you were aiming at, but you accrue a new way of looking at the world and a set of skills. Well, if you just keep doing that, you have multiple ways of looking at the world and more skill. Well, that's your storehouse of treasure. As you walk through life in your normal mode, things will call to you. And if you pursue them, they will take you deep. It doesn't really matter what it is that calls. What matters is that you pursue it, and you pursue it to the depths. And as you pursue it to the depths, you will become transformed. And if you do that without reservation, that will turn you into the person who frees the slaves and opposes the tyrants. And that is how it works. That's the call. And that can happen in any direction, virtually any direction. You just have to pursue it with sufficient faith. That's that willingness to gaze into the abyss, which is obviously what you were doing when you went to Ukraine. It's like,
It's gazing into the abyss that makes you better. The thing is, and this is maybe where Nietzsche's idea is not as differentiated as it became. Sometimes your gaze can be forcefully directed towards the abyss, and then you're traumatized. If it's involuntary and accidental, it can kill you. The more it's voluntary, the more transformative it is. And that's part of that idea about facing death and hell. It's like, can you tolerate death and hell? And the answer is, this terrible answer is, yes, to the degree that you're willing to do it voluntarily. And then you might ask, well, why should I have to subject myself to death and hell? I'm innocent. And then the answer to that is, even the innocent must be voluntarily sacrificed to the highest.
That's such an interesting distinction. Voluntary suffering.
Voluntary, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's why the central Christian doctrine is pick up your cross and follow me. And I'm speaking not in religious terms saying that. I'm just speaking as a psychologist. It's like one of the things we've learned in the last 100 years is voluntary exposure to that which freezes and terrifies you in measured proportions is curative. The first thing I do as a clinician, if someone comes to me and says they're depressed, is ask myself a question. Well, what does this person mean by that? So I have to find out, like, because maybe they're not depressed, maybe they're hyper anxious, or maybe they're obsessional. Like there's various forms of powerful negative emotion. So they need to be differentiated. But then the next question you have to ask is, well, are you depressed? Or do you have a terrible life? Or is it some combination of the two? So if you're depressed, as far as I can tell, you don't have a terrible life. You have friends, you have family, you have an intimate relationship, you have a job or a career. You're about as educated as you should be given your intelligence. Use your time outside of work wisely. You're not beholden to alcohol or other temptations. You're engaged in the community in some fundamental sense, and all that's working. Now, if you have all that and you're feeling really awful, you're either ill or you're depressed. And so then sometimes there's a biochemical route to that, treatment of that. My experience has been as a clinician is if you're depressed, but you have a life and you take an antidepressant, it will probably help you a lot. Now, maybe you're not depressed. Exactly. You just have a terrible life. What does that look like? You have no relationship. Your family's a mess. You've got no friends. You've got no plan. You've got no job. You use your time outside of work, not only badly, but destructively. You have a drug or alcohol habit or some other vice, pornography addiction. You're completely unengaged in the surrounding community. You have no scaffolding whatsoever to support you in your current mode of being or you move forward. And then as a therapist, well, you do two things. Well, if it's depression per se, well, like I said, there's sometimes a biochemical route, a nutritional route. There's ways that can be addressed. It's probably physiological if you're, at least in part, if you're depressed but you have an okay life. Sometimes it's conceptual. You can turn to dreams, sometimes to help people, because dreams contain the seeds of the potential future. And if your person is a real good dreamer and you can analyze dreams, that can be really helpful. But that seems to be only true for more creative people. And for the people who just have a terrible life, it's like, okay, you have a terrible life. Well, let's pick a front. How about you need a friend, like one sort of friend. Do you know how to shake hands and introduce yourself? I'll have the person show me. So let's do it for a sec. So, yes, hi, I'm Jordan. And people don't know how to do that. And then they can't even get the ball rolling.
For the listener, Jordan just gave me a firm handshake.
Yeah, as opposed to a dead fish. You know, and there's these elementary social skills that hypothetically, if you were well cared for, you learned when you were like 3. And sometimes people have, I had lots of clients
to whom no one ever paid any attention. And they needed like 10,000 hours of attention. And some of that was just listening, because they had 10,000 hours of conversations they never had with anyone, and they were all tangled up in their head. And they had to just, one client in particular, I worked with this person for 15 years. And what she wanted from me was for me just to shut the hell up for 50 minutes, which was very hard for me, and to just tell me what had happened to her. And then what happened at the end of the conversation, then I could discuss a bit with her. And then as we progressed through the years, the amount of time that we spent in discussion increased in proportion in these sessions, until by the time we stopped seeing each other, when my clinical practice collapsed, we were talking about 80% of the time. But she'd never been attended to properly, ever. And so she was an uncarved block in the Taoist sense, right? She hadn't been subjected to those flaming swords that separated the wheat from the chaff. And so you can do that in therapy. If you're listening and you're depressed, I would say, if you can't find a therapist, and that's getting harder and harder, because it's actually become illegal to be a therapist now, because you have to agree with your clients, which is a terrible thing to do with them. Just like it's terrible just to arbitrarily oppose them. You could do the self-authoring program online, because it helps you write an autobiography. And so if you have memories that are more than 18 months old that bother you when you think them up, part of you is locked inside that. An undeveloped part of you is still trapped in that. That's a metaphorical way of thinking about it. That's why it still has emotional significance. So you can write about your past experiences, but I would say wait for at least 18 months if something bad has happened to you, because otherwise you just hurt yourself again by encountering it. You can bring yourself up to date with an autobiography. There's an analysis of faults and virtues, that's the present authoring, and then there's a guided writing exercise that helps you make a future plan. That's young men who do that, to go to college, young men who do that, 90 minutes, just the future authoring, 90 minutes, they're 50% less likely to drop out. That's all it takes. Like, I had clients who were so depressed they literally couldn't get out of bed. So what's their first step? It's like, can you sit up once today? No. Can you prop yourself up on your elbows once today? Like, you scale back the dragon till you find one that's conquerable, that moves you forward. There's a rubric for life. Scale back the dragons till you find one conquerable, and it'll give you a little bit of gold, commensurate with the struggle. But the plus side of that, because you think that, God, that's depressing. You mean I have to start by sitting up? Well, you do if you can't sit up. But the plus side of that is, it's the Pareto distribution issue, is that aggregates exponentially increase. And failures do too, by the way, but aggregates exponentially increase. So once you start the ball rolling, it can get zipping along pretty good. This person that I talked about was incapable of sitting with me in a cafe when we first met, just talking, even though I was her therapist. But by the end, she was doing stand-up comedy. So, it took years, but still, most people won't do stand-up comedy. That's quite the bloody achievement. She would read her poetry on stage too. So for someone who was petrified into paralysis by social anxiety, and who had to start very small, it was a hell of an accomplishment.
Sometimes you can come across something new that helps you reconfigure the way that you're living almost instantly in a more comprehensive and fuller way. But more common is the traumatic response, which is when the presuppositions of your world are shifted dramatically and you fall into the surrounding chaos. Then it's so hard on you that, it actually does you psychophysiological damage. If someone goes after you at the good person level of analysis, and they just demolish you, in the course of, say, a 3-year relationship, hacking away at the idea that you have any moral worth whatsoever, this is what happens when you're abused, then that's going to knock you into pieces at a very complex and high level of abstraction, so that can undermine your entire worldview. If the person instead helps you retool the little behaviors and the little microstructures that make you up, and if you're willing to participate in that, and if you're open to corrective feedback from the world, then you can continually adjust yourself at a small level, and then that makes the things in the hierarchy a little higher, a little healthier, and then that makes the aggregation of those things a little higher in the hierarchy a little healthier and a little more complete. Then you can do this bit by bit retooling without ever having to suffer the demolition of huge chunks of your personality. So let's go back to the relationship where there's a betrayal. It's like virtually every time someone gets flipped upside down because of a betrayal in a relationship, after the betrayal happens, they say to themselves, there were all these signs I didn't pay attention to. So, and maybe the first sign is, who knows, your partner starts to flirt a bit more when you go out on a social occasion. And not a lot more, just a bit more. And you decide, because maybe you're timid, that that's okay. You're not going to do anything about it. But it's interesting that it happens. It grabs your attention. And it means something. But what you decide is, it's not worth paying attention to. And so maybe the next 8 times that you go out, the same thing happens, but it happens at a somewhat accelerated rate. And then maybe the person starts to go out without you. And so on. There's this progression towards the end state of betrayal. And every time you get a little hint, the world tells you that something's going on, you put it aside and you fail to take it into account. Well, you're foregoing your opportunity to adjust the relationship at micro stages, because maybe what you should have done the first time that happened is you should have gone home with your partner and said, what the hell's going on? Like, this is what was happening. Why are you doing that? Here's how you should have behaved. And of course, that's going to be a fight. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But it might be a micro fight instead of a the relationship is over fight. And in order to keep a relationship healthy, it needs to be retooled at micro levels constantly. And the same is the case with your own character. When you encounter something that's unexpected, especially if it's small enough to handle, you need to extract the information from it, rebuild the world, and rebuild yourself. And then maybe if you continue doing that, every time you get evidence of an anomaly or an error, or every time the world manifests some meaning to you, then you won't have to fall apart, because the structure that constitutes you is going to remain viable and healthy from the bottom up. And if you don't do that, then those errors are going to accumulate, and when they finally do manifest themselves as unavoidable, like when your partner says, I don't want to be with you anymore, or I've been with someone else for the last year, there's no ignoring that, then the whole thing comes crashing down. You're no longer in a relationship, you're no longer in a good relationship, and then all the other things become questionable. So, meaning manifests itself so that you can retool being itself on a continual basis while simultaneously minimizing the risk of total collapse. And morality then becomes the act of paying sufficient attention and reacting sufficiently so that that corrective process occurs. Now, so you're inside one of these. You're going from point A to point B. And as you do that, things you want to have happen, happen. And things you don't want to have happen, and things you don't understand happen. And let's say that you investigate the things that you don't want to have happen, and you investigate the things that you didn't expect. And you do that as soon as they come up. So then what happens? Well, partly what happens is you're going to change your perceptions a bit, and you're going to change your actions a bit, and what that'll culminate in over time is that this whole structural change. So instead of going from point A to point B, maybe you start shifting so that you're going from point A to point C, because as you're gathering information as a consequence of the inadequacies of the way you're looking at the world, not only are you improving your ability to perceive and to act, but you're also gathering information that helps shift your perspective to a better point B, because you might say, well, where are you going and why? And the answer to that is, well, you have a plan. You're going to get your degree. I don't know what your long-term plan is, but there's no reason to assume that your long-term plan is correct, even though there's no reason to assume that you can do without one. So you're in this weird situation where you have to live within a bounded space, and the bounded space is going to produce errors, and it's also going to be wrong. But at the same time, if you use the bounded space, then you can transform it continually across time, even what it's aimed at, and you can minimize the probability of precipitous collapse. You know, if you limit someone's free speech, not only do you limit the rights of the person who's speaking, but you limit the rights of those who could have heard. And it seems to me that I believe that people have the intelligence to make up their own minds, and that they should have the information presented to them. My experience has been that people are far more intelligent and perspicacious than we generally assume. They come to the right conclusions. Who's to say? But, you know, I don't think there's anything more important than freedom of speech.